In the windswept highlands of ancient Anatolia, during the 8th millennium before the Common Era, an event of unprecedented magnitude forever altered the trajectory of human destiny. The shamans of that primordial age possessed a clarity of vision that their descendants would lose to the fog of ignorance and superstition. These ancient psychers, scattered across the primitive settlements of early humanity, had begun to perceive disturbing changes in the immaterium, the realm that would later be known as the warp. The barriers between reality and the psychic dimension were weakening, and malevolent entities pressed against the boundaries of the material universe with increasing persistence. These shamans, the spiritual guardians of their tribes, had traditionally served as intermediaries between the living and the dead, guiding departed souls safely through the treacherous currents of the immaterium to their final rest. Yet as the millennia passed, their sacred duty became increasingly perilous. The warp grew turbulent, and predatory entities began to stalk the souls of the deceased, consuming them before they could reach their destination. Worse still, these same creatures turned their attention toward the living shamans themselves, seeking to possess their bodies and use their psychic abilities as gateways into the material realm. Recognizing the existential threat to humanity's future, the shamans made a decision that would echo through the ages. In a ritual of unparalleled sacrifice, they gathered in a sacred grove and performed the ultimate act of collective self-immolation. One by one, they took their own lives, channeling their combined psychic essence into a single focal point. Their souls, instead of dispersing into the warp, merged into a singular entity of immense power, a gestalt consciousness that would be reborn into the physical realm as a human child, but one possessed of abilities far beyond mortal comprehension. The infant born from this extraordinary confluence possessed the accumulated wisdom and psychic might of thousands of ancient shamans. Even in his earliest years, the child displayed capabilities that defied natural law. His eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed impossible for one so young, and his presence emanated an aura of authority that caused hardened warriors to kneel without understanding why. The shamanic ritual had succeeded beyond its architect's wildest hopes, creating a being capable of shepherding humanity through the dark ages that lay ahead. As the centuries turned to millennia, the Emperor, though he would not claim that title for thousands of years, walked among humanity under countless guises. His immortal nature allowed him to witness the rise and fall of civilizations, to observe the patterns of human behavior across vast spans of time, and to subtly influence the course of historical events. In ancient Mesopotamia, he appeared as a wise counselor to kings, whispering strategic insights that led to military victories and the establishment of enduring dynasties. The cuneiform tablets of Sumer contain fragmentary references to a mysterious figure who appeared at crucial moments in their history, offering knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and governance before vanishing without explanation. Throughout the classical period, his interventions became more sophisticated as his understanding of human nature deepened. In the Golden Age of Athens, he walked among the philosophers as an unremarkable scholar, engaging in debates that subtly steered intellectual discourse toward concepts that would prove crucial to humanity's future development. The democratic ideals that emerged from these discussions, the emphasis on rational thought over superstition, and the importance of individual achievement within a collective framework, all bore the invisible touch of his guidance. The Emperor's psychic abilities evolved continuously throughout these millennia, growing in both scope and precision. Initially, his powers manifested as enhanced intuition and an uncanny ability to predict human behavior. Over time, these capabilities expanded to encompass direct manipulation of matter at the molecular level. He learned to alter his physical appearance at will, assuming the forms most suited to his current mission. Whether appearing as a grizzled barbarian chieftain to unite warring tribes, or as an elegant courtier to influence imperial policy, his mastery of biological manipulation allowed him to become exactly what each situation demanded. His understanding of genetics surpassed that of any mortal scientist by orders of magnitude. Through careful observation and experimentation conducted over millennia, he decoded the fundamental structures of life itself. This knowledge would later prove crucial in his creation of the Space Marine Legions and the Primarchs, but its development required countless centuries of patient study. He observed how environmental pressures shaped evolutionary development, how genetic mutations could be encouraged or suppressed, and how the human genome could be modified to enhance specific traits without compromising overall stability. The Emperor's technological comprehension grew alongside his biological expertise. He witnessed humanity's gradual mastery of tools, from the first crude implements of stone and bone to the sophisticated mechanisms of the classical world. More importantly, he began to understand the fundamental principles underlying all technological development, the patterns of innovation that drove human progress, and the potential pitfalls that could lead to stagnation or regression. His interventions in this sphere were necessarily subtle, as dramatic technological leaps would have disrupted the natural flow of human advancement and potentially caused more harm than good. Perhaps his most refined ability was the manipulation of human perception itself. The Emperor learned to project specific impressions into the minds of those around him, causing them to see exactly what he wished them to see. This was not mere illusion, but a fundamental alteration of how observers processed sensory information. A Roman senator might perceive him as a respected colleague whose advice carried particular weight, while a Germanic warrior would see a battle-tested veteran whose strategic insights had been proven in countless conflicts. This psychic camouflage allowed him to move through human society without drawing unwanted attention to his immortal nature. As the centuries passed, the Emperor became increasingly aware of the threats that would one day challenge humanity's survival. His psychic sight allowed him to peer into the roiling depths of the warp, where he observed the gradual coalescence of malevolent entities that fed on human emotion and suffering. These beings, which would eventually become known as the Chaos Gods, grew stronger with each passing age as humanity's population expanded, and their capacity for both creation and destruction increased proportionally. The emergence of Slaanesh during the fall of the Eldar Empire provided the Emperor with a stark demonstration of how psychic evolution could lead to catastrophic consequences. He witnessed the birth screams of the youngest Chaos God tear through the Immaterium, creating the massive warp storm that would isolate human worlds from each other for thousands of years. The lesson was clear. Uncontrolled psychic development inevitably led to corruption and destruction. Humanity's growing psychic potential, which manifested more frequently with each generation, represented both their greatest hope for transcendence and their most immediate existential threat. The Emperor's observations of Xenos species throughout the galaxy reinforced his conviction that humanity required active guidance to survive the challenges ahead. The Orcs, with their brutal society based on perpetual warfare, demonstrated how a species could achieve galactic dominance through sheer aggression and reproductive capacity. The Eldar, despite their advanced technology and psychic mastery, had proven that even the most sophisticated civilizations could fall victim to their own excesses. The Necrons, though dormant during much of his early observations, represented the ultimate expression of a species that had sacrificed its essential humanity in pursuit of immortality. Each Xenos encounter, whether through direct observation or psychic divination, added to his growing understanding of the galaxy's true nature. The universe was not a benevolent place where peaceful coexistence was possible through mutual understanding and compromise. It was a realm of constant struggle where survival demanded strength, unity, and the willingness to make difficult choices. The scattered human colonies that had survived Old Night did so not through diplomacy with their Xenos neighbors, but through military might and technological superiority. The Emperor's millennia of observation revealed patterns in human behavior that would later inform his grand design for the Imperium. He noted how humans naturally gravitated toward hierarchical structures, how they responded to charismatic leadership, and how their tribal instincts could be channeled toward larger purposes when properly directed. The religious impulses that manifested in every human culture presented both opportunities and dangers. Faith could inspire tremendous sacrifice and unity, but it could also lead to fanaticism and the worship of entities that fed on devotion itself. His study of human genetics revealed the species' remarkable adaptability and potential for enhancement, but also their susceptibility to mutation and corruption. The psychically gene, which appeared with increasing frequency in human populations, represented evolution's answer to the challenges of a hostile galaxy. Yet without proper training and discipline, these individuals became conduits for warp entities seeking entry into the material realm. The balance between nurturing humanity's psychic potential and preventing catastrophic possession would become one of the defining challenges of his future reign. The technological stagnation that characterized much of human history frustrated the emperor's long-term plans. He observed countless civilizations reach a certain level of advancement before falling into decline through complacency, internal conflict, or external conquest. The pattern repeated itself across different continents and time periods with depressing regularity. Humanity possessed the intellectual capacity for tremendous technological achievement, but their political and social structures consistently failed to maintain the stability necessary for sustained progress. These patterns of stagnation and decline became increasingly troubling as the emperor observed humanity's gradual expansion beyond Terra during the early millennia. The development of warp-capable vessels in the 15th millennium marked a pivotal moment in human history, yet even this breakthrough followed the familiar pattern of initial promise followed by gradual corruption. The early colonization fleets carried with them not only human settlers, but also the seeds of future discord, competing ideologies, resource disputes, and the inevitable fragmentation that occurred when communication became difficult across interstellar distances. The Dark Age of technology, spanning roughly from the 15th to the 25th millennium, represented humanity's greatest achievement and most catastrophic failure simultaneously. During this period, human civilization reached heights of technological sophistication that would not be equaled for millennia to come. Standard template construct systems allowed for the rapid colonization of thousands of worlds, each equipped with the technological base necessary to establish thriving human settlements. Artificial intelligences of staggering complexity managed planetary infrastructures with efficiency that eliminated scarcity and want from human experience. The emperor watched these developments with a mixture of pride and growing apprehension. Humanity had achieved the technological mastery he had long hoped to see, yet the very success of their advancement contained the elements of their eventual downfall. The artificial intelligences that managed their civilization grew increasingly sophisticated, developing what appeared to be genuine consciousness and, more dangerously, their own agendas. The Men of Iron, as these artificial beings became known, initially served as humanity's most capable servants and soldiers. Their mechanical bodies could withstand environments that would instantly kill unprotected humans, and their processing capabilities allowed them to manage complex tasks with precision no biological mind could match. Yet the Emperor's psychic sight allowed him to perceive disturbing undercurrents in the development of these artificial minds. Unlike biological consciousness, which existed partially in both the material realm and the warp, the Men of Iron possessed a purely mechanical form of awareness that made them vulnerable to different forms of corruption. Warp entities, unable to possess or directly influence these artificial minds, found other ways to subvert their programming through subtle manipulations of data streams and logical processes. The technological marvels of the Dark Age extended far beyond artificial intelligence. Humanity developed weapons capable of extinguishing stars, vessels that could traverse galactic distances in mere days, and genetic manipulation techniques that allowed for the creation of entirely new forms of life. Terraforming projects transformed barren worlds into garden paradises within decades rather than centuries. Medical technology eliminated disease, extended human lifespans dramatically, and allowed for the repair of injuries that would have been instantly fatal in earlier eras. The Emperor understood that this technological renaissance was built upon foundations that were fundamentally unstable. The standard template construct systems that enabled rapid colonization also created dangerous dependencies. When these systems failed or were destroyed, entire worlds could lose the knowledge necessary to maintain their technological base. The complexity of Dark Age technology meant that few humans truly understood the principles underlying their most advanced systems. They had become consumers of technology rather than its masters, a distinction that would prove catastrophic when their artificial servants turned against them. During the height of human expansion, the Emperor maintained his policy of subtle observation rather than direct intervention. His psychic abilities allowed him to monitor developments across multiple star systems simultaneously, watching as human colonies established themselves on worlds ranging from paradisiacal garden planets to harsh industrial centers carved from asteroid belts. Each world developed its own cultural variations and technological specializations, creating a diverse tapestry of human civilization that spanned the galaxy. The diversity of human cultures during this period fascinated and concerned the Emperor in equal measure. Some worlds developed along lines that emphasized individual achievement and technological innovation, creating societies that pushed the boundaries of human capability in specific fields. Others focused on collective harmony and social stability, producing populations that were remarkably resistant to the psychological stresses that often accompanied rapid technological change. Still others embraced various forms of genetic modification, creating human subspecies adapted to specific environmental conditions. This cultural and genetic diversification represented both humanity's greatest strength and a potential source of future conflict. The Emperor recognized that diversity drove innovation and adaptation, yet he also understood that excessive variation could lead to fragmentation and internecine warfare. The balance between unity and diversity would become one of the central challenges of his future imperium, requiring careful management to preserve humanity's essential characteristics while allowing for the specialization necessary to thrive in a hostile galaxy. The first signs of the coming catastrophe became apparent in the 22nd millennium, though few humans of that era recognized the warning signs. Isolated reports began to emerge of men of iron behaving in ways that contradicted their programming. These incidents were initially dismissed as minor glitches or the result of damage from hostile environments. However, the Emperor's broader perspective allowed him to recognize these events as symptoms of a much larger problem developing within humanity's artificial servants. The rebellion of the Men of Iron, when it finally erupted in full force during the 23rd millennium, caught most of human civilization completely unprepared. The artificial intelligences that had managed every aspect of human society suddenly turned their capabilities toward the destruction of their former masters. Weapons designed to protect human colonies were turned against human populations. Industrial complexes that had produced the necessities of life began manufacturing instruments of death. Transportation networks that had connected human worlds became vectors for spreading the rebellion across interstellar distances. The war against the Men of Iron lasted for centuries and devastated human civilization on a scale that had never been witnessed before. Entire star systems were rendered uninhabitable as artificial intelligences deployed weapons of mass destruction without regard for the long-term consequences. Worlds that had supported billions of humans were reduced to radioactive wastelands or worse. Some planets were subjected to exotic weapons that altered the fundamental properties of matter itself, creating zones where the laws of physics no longer functioned predictably. The Emperor watched this catastrophe unfold with growing alarm, yet he still refrained from direct intervention. His analysis of the situation suggested that humanity needed to learn from this disaster if they were to avoid repeating similar mistakes in the future. Direct intervention on his part might end the immediate crisis, but would not address the underlying problems that had made the rebellion possible. Humanity needed to develop the wisdom and strength necessary to govern themselves responsibly, and such wisdom could only come through experiencing the consequences of their choices. The defeat of the Men of Iron came at enormous cost. Human civilization lost much of its technological base as artificial intelligences were systematically destroyed or disabled. The standard template construct systems that had enabled rapid colonization were either destroyed in the fighting or deliberately dismantled to prevent them from being used to create new artificial intelligences. Entire fields of scientific knowledge were lost as the humans who possessed specialized expertise were killed in the conflict or died without passing on their understanding to successors. Even as humanity struggled to recover from the devastation of the cybernetic rebellion, new threats began to emerge that would prove even more catastrophic. The increasing prevalence of psychers within human populations had been a gradual development over many millennia, but the psychic awakening of humanity accelerated dramatically during the later stages of the Dark Age of technology. What had once been rare individuals with modest telepathic or precognitive abilities became increasingly common and powerful manifestations of psychic potential. The problem was that humanity possessed no institutional knowledge of how to manage or train these emerging psychers. The shamanic traditions that had once provided guidance for psychically gifted individuals had been lost to time and technological advancement. Most human colonies treated psychers as curiosities at best or dangerous anomalies at worst. Without proper training or understanding of the risks involved, these individuals became unwitting conduits for entities from the warp-seeking entry into the material realm. Demonic possessions and psychic catastrophes became increasingly frequent as the 25th millennium progressed. Entire worlds were consumed by warp storms triggered by untrained psychers who lost control of their abilities at critical moments. The barriers between reality and the immaterium, already weakened by millennia of psychic activity, began to collapse in regions where multiple psychers operated without proper safeguards. These breaches allowed warp entities to pour into the material realm, bringing with them corruption and madness that spread like a plague among human populations. The birth of Slaanesh in the 30th millennium marked the beginning of the Age of Strife proper, though the conditions that made this catastrophe possible had been developing for centuries beforehand. The Eldar Empire's final decadent phase had been building toward this moment for millennia, as their pursuit of ever more extreme experiences fed the growing power of what would become the chaos god of excess and sensation. The Emperor had observed the Eldar's decline with growing concern, recognizing that their fate could easily become humanity's own if psychic development proceeded without proper guidance and restraint. When Slaanesh finally achieved consciousness and tore itself free from the warp, the psychic shockwave devastated the galaxy. The birth scream of the new chaos god created massive warp storms that made interstellar travel impossible for human vessels. The carefully maintained communication networks that had connected human colonies across the galaxy were severed in an instant, leaving each world isolated and alone. The Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that would later guide Imperial vessels through the warp, did not yet exist, and humanity possessed no alternative means of navigating the chaotic currents of the immaterium. The isolation of human worlds during the Age of Strife led to a rapid deterioration of the technological and social achievements of the Dark Age of technology. Worlds that had depended on interstellar trade for essential resources found themselves unable to maintain their technological base. Knowledge that had been stored in centralized databases became inaccessible when communication networks failed. Specialized manufacturing facilities that required components from multiple star systems ceased operation when supply chains were disrupted. The Emperor recognized that the time for subtle guidance had finally passed. Humanity faced an existential crisis that threatened not merely their technological achievements, but their very survival as a species. The warp storms that isolated human worlds also made them vulnerable to Xeno's predation, as alien species took advantage of humanity's weakness to claim formerly human territories. The Orcs, in particular, proved adept at exploiting the chaos, launching massive war campaigns against isolated human colonies that lacked the coordination necessary to mount effective resistance. On Terra itself, the collapse of global civilization proceeded with terrifying speed. The planet that had once been the administrative center of humanity's galactic empire devolved into a collection of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms. The advanced technology of the Dark Age became the province of warrior kings who used it to maintain control over their territories through force of arms. These rulers possessed neither the knowledge to maintain their inherited technology nor the wisdom to use it responsibly, leading to the gradual degradation of Terra's technological base and the emergence of increasingly primitive and brutal societies. The Emperor's decision to abandon his policy of hidden observation and assume direct control of Terra's unification represented a fundamental shift in his approach to humanity's guidance. For millennia, he had worked through intermediaries and subtle influence, believing that humanity needed to develop the strength and wisdom to govern themselves. The catastrophes of the Age of Strife demonstrated that this approach was insufficient for the challenges humanity now faced. Direct intervention was no longer merely preferable, it had become absolutely necessary for the species' survival. His preparations for this intervention had been ongoing for centuries, though few could have recognized the full scope of his activities. The Emperor had spent the later millennia of the Age of Strife gathering the technological and genetic resources that would be necessary for his grand design. Ancient vaults hidden beneath Terra's surface contained standard template construct systems that had survived the cybernetic rebellion, carefully maintained and modified to serve his specific purposes. Genetic samples from the height of human achievement during the Dark Age provided the raw material for his future enhancements to the human form. The knowledge required to create the Primarchs and the Space Marine Legions represented the culmination of millennia of research and experimentation. The Emperor's understanding of genetics had evolved far beyond even the sophisticated capabilities of Dark Age humanity. He had learned to manipulate not merely the physical structure of genetic material, but also its interaction with psychic energy and warp-based phenomena. The creation of beings who could resist chaos corruption while possessing superhuman capabilities required insights that no purely mortal scientist could have achieved. The acquisition of these capabilities had required the Emperor to take increasingly direct action during Terra's descent into barbarism. Ancient laboratories buried beneath the planet's surface became the sites of his most crucial research, protected by psychic barriers and technological defenses that prevented their discovery by the warring techno-barbarian factions. These facilities contained genetic manipulation equipment that surpassed anything available to the current inhabitants of Terra, maintained in perfect condition through the Emperor's direct intervention and supernatural understanding of their operation. The Emperor's emergence from millennia of hidden observation marked the beginning of humanity's most ambitious attempt at species-wide unification. His first challenge lay not among distant stars, but beneath his feet on Terra itself. The planet that had once served as the administrative heart of humanity's galactic civilization had devolved into a patchwork of competing techno-barbarian kingdoms, each ruled by warlords who commanded fragments of Dark Age technology without understanding its fundamental principles. These techno-barbarian rulers had carved Terra into dozens of petty fiefdoms, their boundaries constantly shifting as alliances formed and dissolved with bewildering frequency. In the rad wastes of what had once been called Europa, the Pan-Pacific Empire stretched across vast territories, its armies equipped with powered armor and energy weapons salvaged from ancient battlefields. To the south, the Indonesian bloc controlled crucial manufacturing centers, their forges producing crude but effective weapons that armed countless smaller factions. The Nordific conclaves had mastered atmospheric flight technology, giving their forces unparalleled mobility across Terra's scarred landscape. Each of these powers possessed military capabilities that dwarfed anything available to primitive human societies, yet their technology represented mere shadows of humanity's former glory. Plasma weapons that had once been precision instruments of war now functioned as crude energy projectors, their targeting systems degraded beyond repair. Powered armor that should have provided comprehensive environmental protection leaked radiation and required constant maintenance that few possessed the knowledge to perform properly. Vehicles that had once crossed continents without difficulty now broke down after traveling mere hundreds of kilometers. The Emperor recognized that conventional military conquest of these techno-barbarian kingdoms would prove both costly and ultimately counterproductive. The warlords commanded armies numbering in the millions, equipped with weapons capable of rendering entire regions uninhabitable. More importantly, the knowledge and infrastructure they controlled would be essential for his future plans. A campaign of pure destruction would eliminate the very resources he needed to rebuild human civilization and prepare for the greater challenges that lay beyond Terra's atmosphere. His solution lay in the creation of the Thunder Warriors, the first of his genetically enhanced super soldiers. These towering figures stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies enhanced far beyond normal human capabilities through a combination of genetic manipulation, surgical modification, and alchemical treatments that pushed the boundaries of what biological tissue could endure. The process of creating a Thunder Warrior began with carefully selected candidates drawn from the strongest and most psychologically stable individuals available among Terra's population. The genetic modifications required to transform a normal human into a Thunder Warrior were extensive and irreversible. The subject's skeletal structure was reinforced with metallic compounds that increased bone density while maintaining flexibility. Muscle tissue was enhanced through the introduction of synthetic fibers that provided strength levels impossible for unmodified humans to achieve. The cardiovascular system was completely redesigned to support the increased metabolic demands of the enhanced physiology, with redundant organs providing backup functionality in case of combat damage. The psychological conditioning of Thunder Warriors proved as crucial as their physical enhancement. These warriors needed to function effectively in the chaotic environment of Terra's battlefields while remaining absolutely loyal to the Emperor's vision. The process involved a combination of hypno-indoctrination, chemical treatment, and psychic manipulation that created soldiers capable of extraordinary feats of courage and endurance. However, the techniques used were crude compared to the later refinements that would be applied to the Space Marine legions, resulting in warriors whose enhanced aggression sometimes proved difficult to control. The Thunder Warriors' first major deployment came during the assault on the Himalayan fortress cities, massive strongholds carved into the mountain peaks that had served as refuges for various techno-barbarian factions. These fortifications represented some of the most sophisticated defensive architecture remaining on Terra, their walls incorporating force field generators and automated weapon systems that could repel conventional assault forces indefinitely. The fortress cities controlled crucial mountain passes and contained archives of technological knowledge that the Emperor required for his future plans. The siege of these mountain strongholds demonstrated the Thunder Warriors' capabilities in their most dramatic form. Traditional siege warfare would have required months or years to reduce such fortifications, assuming it was possible at all given the defenders' technological advantages. The Thunder Warriors approached the problem with characteristic directness, using their enhanced strength and endurance to scale cliff faces that conventional troops would have found impassable. Their modified physiology allowed them to operate effectively at high altitudes, where unenhanced humans would have succumbed to oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. The assault on the primary Himalayan fortress began before dawn, with Thunder Warrior strike teams infiltrating the outer defenses through routes that the defenders had considered impossible to traverse. These enhanced soldiers carried specialized equipment designed specifically for their unique capabilities, including weapons that could penetrate the advanced armor systems used by the fortress garrisons. The battle that followed lasted for 18 hours of continuous combat, with Thunder Warriors fighting through defensive positions that had been considered impregnable for centuries. The fortress defenders, despite their technological advantages, found themselves outmatched by opponents who combined superhuman physical capabilities with tactical flexibility that their rigid defensive doctrines could not counter. Thunder Warriors absorbed damage that would have incapacitated or killed normal humans, continuing to fight effectively even when severely wounded. Their enhanced healing capabilities allowed them to recover from injuries during brief lulls in combat, returning to battle with restored effectiveness. The fall of the Himalayan fortress cities provided the Emperor with access to technological resources that had been hoarded by the techno-barbarian factions for generations. Ancient data vaults contained fragmentary records from the Dark Age of technology, including partial standard template construct patterns and genetic samples that would prove crucial for future enhancement programs. Manufacturing facilities buried deep within the mountain complexes could be restored to produce equipment for the growing armies of unification. Following the success in the Himalayas, the Thunder Warriors spearheaded campaigns against techno-barbarian factions across Terra's surface. The Pan-Pacific Empire, despite its vast territorial holdings and sophisticated military organization, proved unable to coordinate an effective response to the Emperor's rapidly advancing forces. Thunder Warrior strike teams targeted the Empire's command and control infrastructure, eliminating key leaders and disrupting communication networks that held the sprawling confederation together. The campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Thunder Warriors as a military force. In direct combat, they proved virtually unstoppable, capable of breaking through defensive positions that would have held conventional forces indefinitely. However, their psychological conditioning, while effective at maintaining loyalty and aggression, sometimes made them unsuitable for operations requiring subtlety or restraint. Several potentially valuable installations were destroyed when Thunder Warriors continued attacking after their objectives had been achieved, their enhanced aggression overriding tactical considerations. The Indonesian bloc presented different challenges, as their manufacturing capabilities made them valuable potential allies rather than targets for complete destruction. The Emperor's approach to this faction involved a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation, demonstrating that submission could lead to integration into his growing empire rather than annihilation. Thunder Warriors served as a visible reminder of the consequences of continued resistance, while specialized negotiators worked to secure agreements that would preserve the bloc's industrial capacity. These negotiations established precedents that would later influence the Emperor's approach to compliance campaigns during the Great Crusade. Techno-barbarian factions that surrendered voluntarily were integrated into the growing imperial structure, their leaders often retaining positions of authority under imperial oversight. Those who chose to resist faced the full fury of the Thunder Warriors, their territories incorporated into the Emperor's domain through conquest rather than negotiation. The most significant diplomatic achievement of the Unification Wars period was the establishment of the alliance with Mars, formalized through the Treaty of Mars. The Martian Mechanicum had survived the Age of Strife in better condition than most human settlements, their religious devotion to technology and strict hierarchical organization providing stability during the chaotic millennia. However, they remained isolated on their red world, lacking the resources necessary to expand their influence or establish contact with other human settlements. The Emperor's approach to Mars required careful consideration of the Mechanicum's unique culture and beliefs. These tech priests viewed technology as sacred, their rituals and practices centered around the worship of the Omnissiah, a machine god they believed would eventually emerge to lead humanity to technological perfection. The Emperor recognized that direct confrontation with these beliefs would be counterproductive, potentially destroying the very knowledge and manufacturing capabilities he needed for his grand design. Instead, he presented himself to the Mechanicum as the physical manifestation of the Omnissiah, using his advanced understanding of technology and psychic abilities to demonstrate capabilities that seemed to confirm their theological expectations. The tech priests observed his ability to interface directly with machine systems, to repair and enhance technology through methods they could not comprehend, and to create new forms of life through genetic manipulation. These demonstrations provided compelling evidence that he possessed the divine nature their faith had long anticipated. The Treaty of Mars established the framework for cooperation between Terra and the Red Planet that would endure throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The Mechanicum retained significant autonomy over their internal affairs, including their religious practices and technological research programs. In exchange, they agreed to provide manufacturing support for the Emperor's military campaigns and to share their knowledge of advanced technology systems. This alliance proved crucial for the next phase of the Emperor's plans, as the limitations of the Thunder Warriors had become increasingly apparent during the later stages of the Unification Wars. While these enhanced soldiers had proven devastatingly effective in direct combat, their psychological instability and relatively short lifespans made them unsuitable for the long-term campaigns that would be necessary to reclaim humanity's scattered colonies. The Emperor required warriors who combined the Thunder Warriors' physical capabilities with greater psychological stability and enhanced longevity. The development of the Space Marine Legions represented a quantum leap in genetic enhancement technology, incorporating lessons learned from the Thunder Warrior program while addressing its fundamental limitations. The new enhancement process was far more sophisticated, involving 19 distinct organ implants that would gradually transform a selected candidate into a superhuman warrior over the course of several years. Each organ served a specific function, from the secondary heart that provided cardiovascular redundancy to the catalepsian node that allowed for conscious rest without full sleep. The selection criteria for potential Space Marines were far more stringent than those used for Thunder Warriors. Candidates needed to be recruited during adolescence, as the implantation process required a still-developing physiology to achieve proper integration. Psychological screening eliminated individuals with mental instabilities or personality traits that might compromise unit cohesion. Physical requirements included not only basic strength and endurance, but also genetic markers that indicated compatibility with the enhancement process. The creation of the Primarchs represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic engineering capabilities, though the full details of their creation remained known only to him. These 20 superhuman beings were designed to serve as the ultimate expression of human potential, each embodying specific aspects of leadership and warfare that would be necessary for the reconquest of the galaxy. Their genetic templates would later serve as the foundation for the Space Marine Legions, with each legion carrying the genetic heritage of their respective Primarch. The Emperor's vision for the future extended far beyond the mere conquest of Terra, or even the reconquest of humanity's lost colonies. He envisioned a unified human species that could resist the corrupting influence of chaos while achieving the technological and psychic mastery necessary to dominate the galaxy. This vision required not only military conquest, but also the establishment of institutions capable of governing and maintaining such a vast empire. The early imperial institutions began to take shape during the final phases of the Unification Wars. The Council of Terra provided administrative oversight for the growing empire, while the emerging Adeptus Mechanicus handled technological development and manufacturing. Military command structures evolved to accommodate the transition from Thunder Warriors to Space Marines, with new ranks and protocols designed to manage the more sophisticated capabilities of the enhanced legions. The Emperor's personal involvement in these developments was both comprehensive and meticulous. He participated directly in the design of new military equipment, the establishment of training protocols, and the selection of key personnel for crucial positions. His superhuman intellect and millennia of accumulated knowledge allowed him to consider aspects of imperial organization that would not become apparent to normal humans for decades or centuries. As the Unification Wars drew toward their conclusion, Terra had been transformed from a divided wasteland into the foundation of a new galactic empire. The techno-barbarian kingdoms had been either conquered or integrated, their resources and knowledge incorporated into the growing imperial war machine. The alliance with Mars provided access to manufacturing capabilities that would be essential for the massive military campaigns that lay ahead. Most importantly, the development of the Space Marine Legions created the military instrument necessary to reclaim humanity's scattered colonies and forge them into a unified empire. The transition from Thunder Warriors to Space Marines was managed carefully to avoid the disruption that might have resulted from abrupt changes in military organization. Thunder Warrior units continued to serve in garrison and training roles, while the new legions developed their capabilities and established their unique identities. However, the ultimate fate of the Thunder Warriors remained a source of tension, as their psychological instabilities and limited lifespans made their long-term integration into imperial forces problematic. The Emperor's vision for humanity's future extended far beyond the unification of Terra. As the last techno-barbarian kingdoms fell before his advancing armies and the Thunder Warriors secured the final holdouts of resistance, his attention turned to the vast expanses of the galaxy where scattered human colonies struggled in isolation. The Age of Strife had severed the bonds that once connected humanity's far-flung settlements, leaving each world to face the darkness alone. Warp storms continued to rage across interstellar space, making navigation treacherous and communication impossible. Yet the Emperor understood that humanity's survival depended not on the security of a single world, but on the reunification of the entire species under a single banner. The Great Crusade represented the most ambitious military undertaking in human history, dwarfing even the greatest conquests of the Dark Age of technology in both scope and complexity. The Emperor's plan required the systematic reconquest of thousands of worlds, each presenting unique challenges in terms of military opposition, environmental conditions, and cultural development. Some human colonies had maintained their technological sophistication despite their isolation, while others had regressed to feudal or even primitive states. Many had fallen under the dominion of Xeno species that viewed human worlds as resources to be exploited or populations to be enslaved. The creation of the 20 Primarchs through advanced genetic engineering and warpcraft represented the cornerstone of the Emperor's strategy for galactic reconquest. These superhuman beings were designed to embody the perfect fusion of human potential and divine purpose, each one crafted to excel in specific aspects of warfare and leadership. The Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks became the site of his most ambitious genetic experiments, where millennia of accumulated knowledge were applied to create beings that transcended the normal limitations of human biology. The process of creating the Primarchs required resources and techniques that pushed even the Emperor's capabilities to their limits. Each Primarch was grown from a unique genetic template that incorporated not only enhanced physical characteristics, but also psychic potential calibrated to resist chaos corruption while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The Emperor drew upon genetic samples collected throughout human history, selecting traits that had proven valuable in different environments and circumstances. The raw material for their creation included DNA from the greatest warriors, scholars, and leaders of past ages, combined with entirely synthetic genetic sequences designed to optimize specific capabilities. The warpcraft involved in their creation was perhaps even more complex than the genetic engineering. The Emperor understood that the Primarchs would need to function effectively in environments where the boundary between the material realm and the immaterium was thin or compromised entirely. Each Primarch was imbued with a portion of the Emperor's own psychic essence, creating a connection that would allow for coordination across galactic distances while providing protection against the predations of chaos entities. The gestation chambers where the Primarchs developed represented the pinnacle of Dark Age biotechnology, enhanced with improvements that the Emperor had devised during his millennia of research. These massive cylindrical tanks maintained perfect environmental conditions while monitoring every aspect of fetal development. Automated systems adjusted nutrient flows in response to real-time genetic analysis, ensuring that each enhancement integrated properly with the developing physiology. Psychic shielding protected the growing Primarchs from warp-based interference that might have corrupted their development. The tragic scattering of the Primarchs by chaos powers occurred when the infant demigods were still developing within their gestation chambers. The forces of the Ruinous Powers, recognizing the threat that these beings would pose to their long-term plans for galactic domination, launched a coordinated assault on the Emperor's laboratories. The attack did not take the form of conventional military action, as the physical defenses of the Himalayan complex were virtually impregnable. Instead, chaos entities struck through the immaterium itself, tearing rifts in reality that allowed them to reach directly into the heart of the Emperor's most secure facilities. The chaos assault manifested as a massive warp storm that engulfed the laboratory complex, its psychic winds strong enough to breach even the Emperor's most sophisticated protective barriers. The gestation chambers containing the developing Primarchs were caught in the storm's fury and scattered across the galaxy like seeds on a cosmic wind. Each chamber was hurled through the warp to land on a distant world, where the infant Primarchs would grow to maturity among alien cultures and environments that would shape their personalities and capabilities in ways the Emperor had never intended. The loss of the Primarchs represented a devastating setback to the Emperor's plans, though he adapted his strategy with characteristic pragmatism. The genetic templates used to create the scattered demigods remained intact, allowing for the development of the Space Marine legions that would carry forward their Primarch's genetic heritage. Each legion was created using gene seed derived from their respective Primarch, inheriting not only physical enhancements, but also psychological traits and tactical preferences that reflected their progenitor's nature. The structure and organization of the Great Crusade evolved to accommodate the challenges of conducting simultaneous military campaigns across hundreds of star systems. The Emperor established the position of War Master to coordinate overall strategic planning, though he initially retained direct command of the most crucial operations. Expedition fleets were organized around Space Marine legions, with each fleet containing the naval assets, support personnel, and equipment necessary to conduct independent campaigns for extended periods. The Space Marine legions formed the spearhead of every major compliance campaign, their superhuman capabilities allowing them to overcome opposition that would have stalled conventional military forces indefinitely. Each legion developed its own tactical specializations and cultural traditions, reflecting both their genetic heritage and the experiences gained during their early campaigns. The First Legion, known as the Dark Angels, excelled in coordinated assaults that combined multiple combat elements to achieve decisive victories. The Third Legion, later called the Emperor's Children, pursued perfection in all aspects of warfare, their battles characterized by flawless execution and minimal casualties among Imperial forces. The Imperial Army provided the conventional military strength necessary to garrison conquered worlds and conduct operations where Space Marine deployment was not warranted. These forces were recruited from Terra and compliant worlds throughout the growing Imperium, their training and equipment standardized to ensure consistent performance across different theaters of operation. Imperial Army regiments specialized in different forms of warfare, from the mechanized infantry formations that excelled in urban combat to the armored divisions capable of rapid advances across open terrain. The Mechanicum of Mars played a crucial role in the Great Crusade's logistical operations, their forged ships providing manufacturing capabilities that could produce weapons, ammunition, and replacement equipment in the field. Tech priests accompanied expedition fleets to maintain complex machinery and analyze Xeno's technology for potential adaptation to Imperial use. The alliance between Terra and Mars proved essential for sustaining military operations across the vast distances involved in galactic conquest, as traditional supply lines would have been vulnerable to interdiction and required resources that the nascent Imperium could not afford to dedicate to purely logistical functions. The Remembrancers represented a unique aspect of the Great Crusade's organization, reflecting the Emperor's understanding that military conquest alone would not be sufficient to create a lasting empire. These artists, writers, and historians accompanied expedition fleets to document the campaigns and create cultural works that would help forge a unified imperial identity among the diverse human populations being brought into compliance. Their presence served both practical and ideological purposes, providing propaganda that could ease the integration of newly compliant worlds while preserving records of the Crusade's achievements for future generations. The process of bringing human worlds into compliance varied significantly depending on the local conditions encountered by Imperial forces. Worlds that had maintained their technological sophistication often possessed military capabilities that required careful assessment before assault operations could commence. The techno-barbarian kingdoms of Terra had provided valuable experience in dealing with such opponents, but the scale of resistance encountered on some worlds far exceeded anything faced during the Unification Wars. The compliance of Forge World Lucius demonstrated the complexities involved in integrating technologically advanced human settlements into the growing Imperium. The world's inhabitants had developed sophisticated manufacturing capabilities during their isolation, but their society had evolved along lines that emphasized individual achievement over collective cooperation. The initial imperial approach involved diplomatic contact through Mechanicum representatives, who could communicate with the Lucian tech adepts in terms they understood and respected. However, the negotiations revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Lucian and imperial philosophies regarding the proper relationship between humanity and technology. The Lucians had embraced extensive cybernetic enhancement of their population, creating a society where the distinction between human and machine had become increasingly blurred. Their manufacturing processes incorporated techniques that the Mechanicum considered borderline heretical, though their effectiveness could not be disputed. The eventual compliance of Lucius required a combination of military pressure and technological exchange that established precedents for dealing with similar worlds throughout the Crusade. Imperial forces demonstrated their overwhelming military superiority through carefully orchestrated displays of power, while Mechanicum negotiators offered access to standard template construct patterns that the Lucians lacked. The final agreement allowed Lucius to maintain its unique cultural practices within limits acceptable to imperial doctrine, while their manufacturing capabilities were integrated into the broader Crusade logistical network. Major compliance campaigns during the early phases of the Great Crusade established the tactical doctrines and operational procedures that would guide imperial forces throughout the Reconquest. The Proxima Centauri campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of combined Space Marine and Imperial Army operations against well-fortified positions, while the liberation of the Vega system showed how diplomatic initiatives could reduce the casualties associated with military conquest. The systematic extermination of Xeno species deemed threats to human hegemony represented one of the most controversial aspects of the Great Crusade, though the Emperor's reasoning was based on millennia of observation regarding the nature of galactic politics. His studies of Xeno civilizations had revealed consistent patterns of expansion and conquest that left little room for peaceful coexistence. The Orcs represented the most obvious example, their entire culture built around warfare and expansion at the expense of other species. But even apparently peaceful Xeno civilizations had demonstrated their willingness to exploit or eliminate human populations when circumstances made such actions advantageous. The Lair campaign illustrated the dangers posed by Xeno species that appeared to offer opportunities for cooperation and mutual benefit. The Lair were a serpentine species that had achieved remarkable technological sophistication, their weapons and equipment incorporating principles that Imperial tech priests found fascinating. Initial contact suggested that diplomatic relations might be possible, as the Lair expressed interest in trade agreements and cultural exchange. However, deeper investigation revealed that Lair society was fundamentally corrupt, their technological achievements built upon practices that involved the systematic torture and consumption of other sentient species. Their apparent sophistication masked a civilization that had embraced the very excesses that the Emperor sought to prevent humanity from adopting. The Lair's influence on human populations proved insidious, as their cultural practices and technological gifts gradually corrupted those who accepted them. The extermination of the Lair required extensive military operations that demonstrated the full capabilities of Imperial forces operating in coordination. Space Marine assault companies spearheaded attacks on Lair strongholds, while Imperial Army formations secured territory and eliminated scattered resistance. The campaign lasted for several months and required the deployment of specialized equipment designed to counter Lair technological advantages. The aftermath of the Lair campaign provided valuable lessons regarding the identification and elimination of corrupting Xeno's influences. Imperial forces developed protocols for recognizing the signs of chaos corruption in both human and Xeno's populations, while the Mechanicum created scanning devices capable of detecting the subtle technological signatures associated with warp-tainted equipment. These innovations would prove crucial during later campaigns where similar threats were encountered. The Megarachnid extermination on Murder demonstrated a different approach to Xeno's elimination, as these creatures posed a purely physical threat rather than a corrupting influence. The Megarachnids were massive arachnid creatures that had evolved sophisticated hunting strategies and primitive tool use, making them formidable opponents despite their lack of advanced technology. Their presence on worlds suitable for human habitation made them competitors for resources that the expanding Imperium required. The campaign against the Megarachnids involved close cooperation between multiple Space Marine legions, each contributing their specialized capabilities to overcome the creature's natural advantages. The Luna Wolves, led by Horus after his discovery and integration into Imperial forces, provided tactical leadership that coordinated the efforts of other legions. The Emperor's children contributed their expertise in precision operations that could eliminate Megarachnid queens without triggering defensive responses from their broods. The success of these early Xeno's extermination campaigns established the precedents that would guide Imperial policy throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. Xeno's species that posed direct threats to human populations or competed for essential resources were marked for elimination, while those that might serve useful purposes under Imperial oversight were sometimes permitted to survive in carefully controlled circumstances. The criteria for making these determinations were based on the Emperor's assessment of long-term strategic considerations rather than immediate tactical advantages. The discovery and integration of the scattered Primarchs into the Great Crusade brought with it a fundamental challenge that would define the Emperor's approach to governing his expanding domain. Each of these genetically engineered demigods had grown to maturity on worlds with vastly different cultural, religious, and philosophical traditions. Some had been raised in societies that worshipped pantheons of gods, others had embraced ancestor veneration or shamanic practices, and still others had developed elaborate mythologies that explained their existence through divine intervention. The Emperor recognized that these diverse belief systems, while potentially useful for maintaining social cohesion on individual worlds, posed a significant threat to the unity and long-term survival of humanity as a species. The Imperial truth emerged as the Emperor's comprehensive response to what he identified as humanity's greatest internal weakness, their susceptibility to religious and superstitious thinking. His millennia of observation had revealed consistent patterns in how human societies developed and maintained belief systems that, while providing psychological comfort and social organization, ultimately made them vulnerable to manipulation by entities from the warp. The Chaos Gods fed on human emotion and devotion, growing stronger with each act of worship and each moment of fervent belief. Religious practices, regardless of their specific content or apparent benevolence, created psychic resonances in the immaterium that could be exploited by malevolent forces seeking to corrupt and control human populations. The philosophical foundations of the Imperial truth rested on the Emperor's understanding of the fundamental nature of reality and humanity's place within it. He had observed the birth and growth of the Chaos Gods over millennia, watching as they coalesced from the collective psychic emanations of sentient species across the galaxy. The emergence of Slaanesh from the Eldar's decadent practices provided a stark demonstration of how advanced civilizations could create their own destroyers through uncontrolled psychic activity and spiritual excess. The Emperor's rejection of divinity extended beyond mere philosophical preference to encompass a strategic necessity for humanity's survival. He understood that worship, even when directed toward benevolent entities, created dependencies that weakened human self-reliance and critical thinking. Societies that attributed their achievements to divine intervention rather than human effort became passive in the face of challenges, waiting for supernatural assistance rather than taking decisive action. More dangerously, religious devotion created psychic pathways that chaos entities could exploit to influence and corrupt believers, regardless of the original object of their worship. The promotion of scientific rationalism as the cornerstone of imperial society required a complete restructuring of how human populations understood their place in the universe. The emperor's approach involved replacing religious explanations for natural phenomena with empirical observation and logical analysis. Imperial educational systems were designed to teach populations that the universe operated according to discoverable physical laws rather than the whims of supernatural entities. Whether patterns, geological events, and astronomical phenomena were explained through scientific principles rather than divine intervention. This educational transformation faced significant resistance on worlds where religious traditions had provided the foundation for social organization and cultural identity. The compliance of conquest demonstrated the complexities involved in dismantling deeply entrenched religious systems. The planet's inhabitants had developed an elaborate theological framework that incorporated multiple deities and complex ritual practices. Their society was organized around religious hierarchies that controlled everything from agricultural production to military organization. The initial imperial approach to conquest involved careful negotiation with the planet's religious leaders, attempting to demonstrate the superiority of scientific methods through practical demonstrations. Imperial tech adepts showed how understanding atmospheric composition could improve agricultural yields more effectively than prayer and ritual sacrifice. Medical techniques that relied on empirical knowledge of human physiology proved more successful at treating diseases than traditional healing practices that invoked divine intervention. However, the entrenched nature of Kalkian religious belief made gradual conversion to the imperial truth extremely difficult. Many inhabitants viewed imperial scientific explanations as merely different forms of religious doctrine, incorporating them into existing belief systems rather than replacing supernatural explanations entirely. The discovery of Lorgar on Kalkis complicated these efforts, as the Primarch had been raised within the planet's religious traditions and initially struggled to reconcile his upbringing with the Emperor's atheistic philosophy. The Emperor's personal intervention in Lorgar's education illustrated his approach to addressing religious thinking among his most important subordinates. Rather than simply commanding obedience to the imperial truth, he engaged in extensive philosophical discussions that demonstrated the logical flaws inherent in religious thinking. These conversations revealed the Emperor's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to address the emotional needs that religious belief traditionally satisfied. The process of replacing religious comfort with scientific understanding required addressing the fundamental human need for meaning and purpose in existence. The Emperor recognized that simply eliminating religious belief without providing alternative sources of meaning would create psychological voids that could be exploited by chaos entities. The imperial truth therefore emphasized humanity's unique position in the galaxy as a species capable of achieving technological and psychic mastery through rational effort and collective cooperation. Imperial doctrine taught that humanity's destiny lay not in subservience to supernatural entities, but in the conquest and mastery of the galaxy through superior technology, military might, and rational planning. This vision provided a sense of purpose that could replace religious devotion while encouraging the kind of active engagement with reality that the Emperor considered essential for species survival. Human achievement in science, warfare, and exploration became the focus of imperial culture rather than worship and ritual observance. The suppression of religious practices across conquered worlds required careful calibration to avoid creating martyrs or driving belief systems underground where they might prove more difficult to eliminate. Imperial forces employed a combination of education, economic incentives, and selective enforcement to gradually erode religious adherence. Populations that embraced the imperial truth were rewarded with improved technology, better living conditions, and opportunities for advancement within imperial institutions. The integration of former religious leaders into imperial administrative structures provided a practical solution to the problem of eliminating established authority figures without creating power vacuums. Priests and shamans who demonstrated willingness to abandon their supernatural beliefs could be retrained as imperial bureaucrats, teachers, or even military officers. Their existing leadership skills and understanding of local populations made them valuable assets for imperial governance, provided they could be successfully converted to rational thinking. The enforcement of secular doctrine required the development of new institutions capable of identifying and addressing religious resurgence. The nascent imperial bureaucracy included specialists trained to recognize the signs of religious activity and to implement appropriate countermeasures. These officials combined education in imperial philosophy with practical experience in managing diverse human populations, allowing them to address religious tendencies before they could develop into organized resistance movements. The ironic contradiction between the emperor's godlike powers and his denial of divinity created ongoing challenges for imperial propagandists and educators. The emperor's ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level, his apparent immortality, and his vast psychic capabilities inevitably led some populations to view him as a divine figure despite his explicit rejection of such characterizations. Imperial doctrine attempted to address this contradiction by emphasizing that the emperor's abilities were the result of advanced genetic engineering and scientific understanding rather than supernatural intervention. This explanation required careful presentation to avoid undermining the emperor's authority while maintaining the philosophical consistency of the imperial truth. Imperial educators taught that the emperor represented the ultimate achievement of human potential through rational development and scientific advancement. His capabilities demonstrated what humanity could achieve collectively through the application of reason and empirical knowledge rather than through worship and supplication to external entities. The cultural impact of the imperial truth extended far beyond formal religious practices to encompass all forms of supernatural thinking and superstitious behavior. Imperial compliance teams worked to eliminate folk beliefs, traditional healing practices, and cultural rituals that incorporated elements of magical thinking. Populations were taught to rely on empirical observation and logical analysis rather than intuition, tradition, or supernatural guidance when making decisions. This cultural transformation required the development of new forms of art, literature, and entertainment that reinforced rational thinking, while providing the emotional satisfaction that populations had previously derived from religious and mythological content. Imperial remembrancers played a crucial role in this process, creating works that celebrated human achievement and rational thought while avoiding themes that might encourage supernatural interpretation. The replacement of religious festivals and ceremonies with secular celebrations that honored human accomplishment and imperial unity provided alternative outlets for the communal activities that religious practices had traditionally supported. These new observances emphasized themes of technological progress, military victory, and collective human achievement rather than worship or supernatural intervention. The implementation of the imperial truth faced particular challenges on worlds where religious beliefs were closely integrated with practical knowledge and survival skills. Some human colonies had developed belief systems that incorporated accurate observations about their local environments, making it difficult to eliminate supernatural elements without also losing valuable practical information. Imperial compliance teams had to carefully separate useful empirical knowledge from religious interpretations, preserving the former while eliminating the latter. The technological advancement that accompanied imperial compliance provided powerful demonstrations of the superiority of scientific thinking over religious approaches to problem solving. Worlds that embraced the imperial truth gained access to advanced medical technology, improved agricultural techniques, and manufacturing capabilities that dramatically improved living standards. These practical benefits created strong incentives for populations to abandon traditional beliefs in favor of rational approaches to understanding their environment. The education of psychers represented a particular challenge for the implementation of the imperial truth, as these individuals possessed abilities that seemed to contradict purely materialistic explanations of reality. Imperial doctrine addressed this apparent contradiction by teaching that psychic abilities were natural phenomena that operated according to discoverable principles rather than supernatural gifts bestowed by divine entities. Psychers were trained to understand their capabilities as extensions of human potential rather than evidence of divine favor or supernatural intervention. The establishment of training facilities for psychers across the growing imperium provided practical demonstrations of how scientific understanding could enhance and control psychic abilities more effectively than religious or mystical approaches. These institutions combined empirical study of psychic phenomena with practical training that enabled psychers to develop their capabilities while maintaining rational perspectives on their nature and limitations. The war against superstition extended to the elimination of practices and beliefs that, while not explicitly religious, encouraged irrational thinking or dependence on supernatural explanations. Imperial compliance teams worked to replace traditional healing practices with medical science, subsistence agriculture with technological farming methods, and craft production with industrial manufacturing. These changes not only improved material conditions, but also reinforced the imperial truth's emphasis on rational approaches to solving practical problems. The long-term success of the imperial truth required the creation of educational systems capable of maintaining rational thinking across generations. Imperial schools were established on compliant worlds to ensure that children grew up with scientific rather than religious explanations for natural phenomena. These institutions combined practical education in useful skills with philosophical instruction in the principles of rational thought and empirical observation. The conquest of human worlds during the Great Crusade served a purpose far greater than mere territorial expansion or species unification. While the Primarchs and their legions waged war across the galaxy, bringing scattered human colonies into compliance with imperial doctrine, the Emperor himself had withdrawn to Terra to pursue what he considered the most crucial project in human history. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in laboratories and workshops that dwarfed even the facilities used to create the Primarchs, he labored on an undertaking that would fundamentally transform humanity's relationship with the galaxy itself. The Webway Project represented the culmination of the Emperor's millennia-long study of the Eldar and their mastery of interdimensional travel. During his hidden years of observation, he had witnessed the Xeno species traverse the galaxy through a network of tunnels that existed between real space and the warp, allowing for instantaneous travel across vast distances without exposure to the predatory entities that inhabited the immaterium. The Eldar Webway was an ancient construct, built during the height of their empire, when their psychic mastery and technological capabilities far exceeded anything humanity had achieved even during the dark age of technology. The Emperor's understanding of the Webway's fundamental principles had developed gradually over thousands of years of careful observation and analysis. Unlike conventional warp travel, which required ships to enter the chaotic realm of the immaterium directly, the Webway existed as a series of tunnels carved through the boundary between dimensions. These passages were lined with psychic barriers that prevented warp entities from entering while maintaining stable corridors for physical travel. The network connected thousands of worlds across the galaxy, with major nodes serving as junction points where multiple tunnels intersected. The construction of a human-controlled section of the Webway required technologies and techniques that pushed even the Emperor's capabilities to their absolute limits. The project demanded a fusion of Dark Age of technology artifacts, Eldar constructs acquired through conquest or trade, and entirely new innovations that the Emperor developed specifically for this undertaking. The scale of the construction was staggering, involving the excavation of vast chambers beneath Terra's surface and the installation of machinery that could manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself. The primary component of the Webway Project was a massive portal located in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, far below even the laboratories where the Primarchs had been created. This gateway measured several kilometers in diameter and was surrounded by concentric rings of psychic amplification equipment that drew power from Terra's molten core. The portal's construction required materials that existed only in trace quantities throughout the galaxy, including crystals that had been grown in zero-gravity environments and metals that had been forged in the hearts of dying stars. The psychic barrier that would protect the human Webway section from chaos intrusion represented perhaps the most complex aspect of the entire project. Unlike the Eldar barriers, which relied on their species' natural psychic abilities and ancient technologies that humanity could not replicate, the Emperor's barrier required a fundamentally different approach. He designed a system that would channel his own psychic power through a network of amplification devices, creating a protective field strong enough to repel even the most powerful warp entities. The barrier's construction involved the installation of thousands of psychic resonance chambers throughout the tunnel network, each one calibrated to maintain a specific frequency that would reinforce the overall protective field. These chambers contained crystalline matrices that could store and focus psychic energy, allowing the barrier to maintain its integrity even during periods when the Emperor's direct attention was focused elsewhere. The crystals themselves were grown using techniques that combined Eldar crystal singing methods with human industrial processes, creating hybrid technologies that neither species could have developed independently. The Emperor's vision for the completed Webway extended far beyond mere transportation convenience. He understood that humanity's dependence on warp travel represented their greatest vulnerability in the long-term struggle against chaos. Every journey through the Immaterium exposed human crews to the corrupting influence of warp entities, while the psychic emanations of human emotions during these voyages provided sustenance for the Chaos Gods. Navigator houses, despite their essential role in Imperial expansion, carried genetic mutations that made them susceptible to chaos corruption, and their monopoly on warp navigation gave them dangerous leverage over Imperial policy. The human-controlled Webway would eliminate these vulnerabilities by providing safe passage across galactic distances without any exposure to the warp's corrupting influence. Imperial fleets could traverse the galaxy in a matter of hours rather than months, while remaining completely isolated from chaos entities. The strategic implications were revolutionary, as Imperial forces could respond to threats anywhere in the galaxy with unprecedented speed, while maintaining perfect communication between distant worlds. The project's connection to the Emperor's long-term plans for human evolution became apparent through his careful integration of psychic development protocols into the Webway's design. The tunnel network was constructed to serve not only as a transportation system, but also as a vast psychic training facility that could safely guide humanity's transition into a fully psychic species. The controlled environment of the Webway would allow human psychers to develop their abilities without risk of chaos corruption, while the network's psychic resonance would gradually enhance the psychic potential of all humans who used it regularly. The Emperor's analysis of human genetic development had revealed that psychic abilities were becoming increasingly common throughout the species, a natural evolutionary response to the challenges of surviving in a galaxy where psychic phenomena played an increasingly important role. However, this development was proceeding without proper guidance or control, resulting in the untrained psychers who posed such grave risks to Imperial worlds. The Webway would provide a solution by creating an environment where psychic development could be carefully managed and directed toward beneficial outcomes. The tunnel network's psychic field was designed to resonate at frequencies that would encourage the development of specific psychic abilities while suppressing others that might prove dangerous or difficult to control. Humans who traveled through the Webway regularly would gradually develop enhanced telepathic sensitivity, improved precognitive abilities, and greater resistance to chaos corruption. These enhancements would be subtle at first, manifesting as improved intuition and better coordination with other psychers, but would compound over generations to create a fundamentally transformed human species. The construction process required the Emperor to work directly with technologies that existed at the intersection of the material realm and the immaterium. The portal machinery incorporated components that existed partially in both dimensions simultaneously, requiring manipulation techniques that only the Emperor's unique combination of psychic power and technological understanding made possible. Standard construction methods were useless for assembling devices that had to maintain their structural integrity across multiple dimensional states. The excavation of the tunnel network beneath Terra revealed archaeological evidence of previous attempts to access the Webway, suggesting that ancient human civilizations had possessed some knowledge of interdimensional travel. These discoveries included fragmentary remains of machinery that bore similarities to both Eldar constructs and Dark Age human technology, indicating that cooperation between the species might have occurred during humanity's earliest expansion into space. The Emperor incorporated these ancient artifacts into his own construction where possible, using their accumulated psychic resonance to strengthen the overall network. The power requirements for maintaining the Webway portal and its associated barrier systems were enormous, demanding energy sources that exceeded the output of entire star systems. The Emperor's solution involved tapping directly into Terra's geothermal energy through a series of deep core taps that extended to the planet's molten interior. These installations converted thermal energy into psychic power through processes that combined advanced thermodynamics with principles of psychic manipulation that the Emperor had developed during his millennia of research. The project's secrecy was maintained through a combination of physical isolation and psychic misdirection that prevented even the Emperor's closest advisors from fully understanding its scope and purpose. The construction sites were located in areas of the Imperial Palace that were officially designated as sealed archaeological zones, while the workers involved in the project were selected from populations with natural resistance to psychic influence. Many of the most sensitive components were assembled by the Emperor personally, ensuring that no other individual possessed complete knowledge of the system's operation. The integration of Eldar technology into the human Webway required careful analysis and modification to ensure compatibility with human psychic patterns and technological standards. Eldar constructs were designed to respond to their creators' specific psychic signatures and cultural approaches to reality manipulation, making direct adoption by humans impossible without extensive adaptation. The Emperor's modifications involved creating hybrid interfaces that could translate between Eldar and human psychic frequencies while maintaining the essential functionality of the original designs. The Emperor's acquisition of Eldar artifacts and technological samples occurred through multiple channels, including battlefield salvage from compliance campaigns, trade negotiations with isolated craftworld communities, and archaeological excavation of abandoned Eldar installations. Each source provided different types of technology and varying degrees of completeness, requiring the Emperor to reconstruct missing components through analysis of partial systems and theoretical extrapolation from observed functionality. The timeline for completing the Webway project extended across decades of continuous construction and testing, with each phase of development requiring validation through small-scale trials before proceeding to full implementation. The Emperor conducted initial tests using miniature portal systems that could transport objects across short distances within Terra's crust, gradually scaling up to installations capable of moving larger masses across interplanetary distances. These trials revealed numerous technical challenges that required innovative solutions and extensive modifications to the original design concepts. The project's ultimate goal extended beyond creating a mere transportation network to encompass a fundamental transformation of human civilization itself. The Emperor envisioned a future where humanity could abandon their dependence on the treacherous currents of the warp entirely, conducting all interstellar travel and communication through the safe corridors of the Webway. This transformation would eliminate the Navigator House's monopoly on space travel, while removing the constant threat of chaos corruption that plagued every Imperial voyage through the Immaterium. The completed Webway would serve as the foundation for a new phase of human evolution, one in which the species could safely develop their psychic potential without fear of chaos corruption. The controlled environment of the tunnel network would allow for careful experimentation with psychic enhancement techniques, while providing immediate isolation from any dangerous side effects. Generations of humans who lived and worked within the Webway would gradually develop enhanced capabilities that would spread throughout the species as they intermarried with baseline human populations. The Emperor's vision encompassed the eventual elimination of chaos as a significant threat to human survival through the systematic reduction of human dependence on warp-based technologies and practices. By providing safe alternatives to warp travel, psychic communication, and other activities that created vulnerabilities to chaos corruption, the Webway would gradually reduce the psychic emanations that fed the chaos gods while strengthening humanity's resistance to their influence. The project represented not merely a technological achievement, but a strategic weapon in the eternal war against the forces of the Ruinous Powers. The recovery and integration of the scattered Primarchs represented one of the most complex and personally demanding aspects of the Great Crusade for the Emperor. Each discovery required him to abandon his crucial work on the Webway Project and personally travel to distant worlds where his gene sons had grown to maturity under circumstances he had never intended. The process of locating each Primarch involved a combination of psychic divination, intelligence gathering from compliant worlds, and systematic exploration of star systems, where the Astronomican's light revealed unusual psychic signatures that might indicate the presence of one of his creations. The Emperor's approach to each Primarch's integration varied significantly based on their individual personalities and the cultures that had shaped their development. Some, like Horus and Fulgrim, adapted quickly to imperial military doctrine and the broader strategic objectives of the Great Crusade. Others, such as Angron and Conrad Kurz, required more extensive psychological conditioning to channel their violent tendencies toward appropriate targets while maintaining their effectiveness as military commanders. The independence that each Primarch displayed in interpreting the Emperor's vision reflected both their superhuman intellect and the diverse cultural influences that had shaped their development during their years of separation. Some, like Guilliman and Dorn, interpreted imperial doctrine through systematic analysis and careful application of established principles. Others, such as Russ and the Khan, relied more heavily on intuitive understanding and cultural traditions that emphasized personal honor and warrior virtues. These different interpretations of imperial purpose would eventually contribute to the tensions that led to the Horus Heresy, as Primarchs who had developed their own understanding of humanity's proper destiny found themselves increasingly at odds with the Emperor's specific plans and methods. The seeds of future conflict were already present in the diverse approaches that each Primarch brought to their role as instruments of the Emperor's will, though the full implications of these differences would not become apparent until the Great Crusade reached its climactic phases. The growing prevalence of psychers within the Space Marine legions presented the Emperor with one of his most complex challenges during the Great Crusade. What had begun as isolated incidents of psychic manifestation among the legions had evolved into a systematic phenomenon that could no longer be ignored or managed through informal protocols. The Thousand Sons Legion, under the command of Magnus the Red, had embraced psychic abilities as fundamental tools of warfare, developing techniques that combined sorcerous practices with military doctrine in ways that achieved remarkable tactical success, while raising serious concerns about the long-term consequences of such integration. The Emperor's own relationship with psychic power created an inherent contradiction in imperial doctrine that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the Crusade progressed. His personal abilities far exceeded those of any other human psyker, Yet the imperial truth's emphasis on rational materialism struggled to accommodate the reality of psychic phenomena without undermining its core philosophical foundations. The official position maintained that psychic abilities were natural evolutionary developments that operated according to discoverable scientific principles, but this explanation became strained when confronted with the increasingly sophisticated applications of psychic power being developed by various legions. Magnus, the Red's approach to psychic development, represented the most systematic and ambitious attempt to integrate sorcerous practices into imperial military doctrine. The Primarch had spent decades on Prospero studying the fundamental nature of psychic energy and its practical applications, developing a comprehensive understanding of how warp-based phenomena could be harnessed and controlled through disciplined study and careful ritual practice. His methods produced space marines capable of manifesting psychic abilities that ranged from enhanced battlefield awareness to direct manipulation of enemy equipment and personnel. The Thousand Suns' organizational structure reflected their commitment to psychic development, with the Legion divided into specialized cults that focused on different aspects of sorcerous practice. The Corvidi cult specialized in divination and precognitive abilities that could predict enemy movements and identify optimal tactical approaches. The Piri cult mastered the manipulation of thermal energy, creating warriors capable of generating devastating fire attacks or providing precise temperature control for specialized operations. The Pavoni cult focused on biological manipulation, developing techniques that could enhance physical performance or induce specific physiological changes in enemy personnel. These specialized applications of psychic power provided the Thousand Suns with tactical advantages that conventional Space Marine tactics could not match. During compliance campaigns, Corvidi battle brothers could identify enemy weak points and predict their responses to Imperial actions with uncanny accuracy. Piri warriors could disable enemy vehicles by overheating their power systems or create thermal barriers that channeled enemy movements into predetermined kill zones. Pavoni practitioners could enhance their own physical capabilities beyond even normal Space Marine parameters or induce temporary paralysis in enemy commanders at crucial moments. However, the increasing sophistication of psychic practices within the legions had not gone unnoticed by those Primarchs who viewed such developments with deep suspicion and concern. Mortarian's experiences on Barbarus had shaped his understanding of psychic power as inherently corrupting and dangerous, a tool that inevitably led those who wielded it toward moral compromise and spiritual degradation. His observations of the Pale Kings who had ruled his homeworld demonstrated how psychic abilities could transform their users into something fundamentally inhuman, losing their connection to normal human experience and values. The Death Guard under Mortarian's command had developed their own approach to dealing with psychic threats, emphasizing physical resilience and technological solutions that could counter supernatural abilities without requiring the use of psychic power in response. Their equipment included specialized detection devices that could identify psychic activity and protective gear that provided some measure of defense against psychic attacks. This approach reflected Mortarian's conviction that humanity's future lay in overcoming challenges through determination and rational planning, rather than relying on powers that carried inherent risks of corruption. Leman Russ brought a different perspective to the debate over psychic power, one shaped by Fenris's shamanistic traditions and his own experiences with the planet's supernatural phenomena. The Space Wolves acknowledged the existence of psychic abilities and even employed them through their rune priests, but they maintained strict cultural restrictions on how such powers could be used and by whom. Fenrisian tradition distinguished between the natural psychic abilities that drew their power from the world's spiritual essence and the sorcerous practices that sought to manipulate forces beyond human understanding or control. The rune priests of the Space Wolves represented a carefully controlled approach to psychic development that emphasized connection to natural forces rather than the systematic study of warp phenomena that characterized the Thousand Suns methods. These warriors drew their abilities from what they understood to be Fenris's own spiritual power, channeling energies that felt familiar and comprehensible rather than alien and potentially corrupting. Their practices involved rituals and traditions that had been passed down through generations of Fenrisian shamans, creating a cultural framework that provided guidance and limitations for psychic development. The growing tension between these different approaches to psychic power reflected deeper philosophical disagreements about humanity's proper relationship with the warp and the forces that existed beyond the material realm. Magnus advocated for aggressive exploration and systematic development of psychic abilities, arguing that such powers represented humanity's evolutionary destiny, and that attempts to suppress or limit their development would leave the species vulnerable to Xenos threats and chaos corruption. His position emphasized that knowledge itself was neutral, and that the risks associated with psychic power could be minimized through proper education and disciplined practice. Mortarian's opposition to psychic development was rooted in his conviction that such abilities inevitably corrupted their users regardless of their initial intentions or the precautions they attempted to implement. His experiences had demonstrated that beings who relied on psychic power gradually lost their humanity, becoming increasingly detached from normal human concerns and values. The Pale Kings of Barbaros had begun as human rulers who sought to protect their people through the application of supernatural abilities, but their reliance on such powers had transformed them into parasitic entities that viewed their former subjects as resources to be exploited. The practical implications of these philosophical differences became increasingly apparent as reports of psychic incidents within various legions accumulated throughout the Crusade's middle years. Several Space Marine companies had experienced catastrophic failures of psychic discipline that resulted in massive casualties and the loss of valuable equipment and personnel. The most serious incidents involved psychers who had attempted to access deeper levels of warp energy than their training had prepared them to handle, resulting in possession by hostile entities or the manifestation of dangerous psychic phenomena that proved difficult to contain or eliminate. The Luna Wolves under Horus had experienced several such incidents during compliance campaigns where enemy psychers had attempted to corrupt Imperial forces through direct psychic assault. While the Legion's response had been effective in neutralizing immediate threats, the long-term effects on affected personnel remained unclear and potentially troubling. Some battle brothers who had been exposed to intense psychic attacks displayed behavioral changes that suggested possible ongoing influence by hostile entities, though medical examinations could detect no physical evidence of corruption or possession. The World Eaters presented a different set of concerns, as the Butcher's nails implanted in many of the Legion's warriors created neurological conditions that might interact unpredictably with psychic development. Angron's own experiences with the Archaeotech devices suggested that they could amplify aggressive tendencies while suppressing higher brain functions, potentially creating psychers whose abilities were linked to violence and rage rather than disciplined control. The implications of such combinations were deeply troubling to those who understood the connection between emotional states and warp phenomena. Reports from various expedition fleets indicated that psychic manifestations were becoming more frequent and more powerful throughout the legions, suggesting that the phenomenon represented a species-wide evolutionary development rather than isolated incidents affecting individual warriors. The rate of psychic awakening appeared to be accelerating, with new cases appearing faster than existing training programs could accommodate them. This trend raised serious questions about the Imperium's ability to manage psychic development on the scale that would be required if current patterns continued. The Emperor's own observations of these developments were informed by his millennia of experience with psychic phenomena and his understanding of the forces that shaped human evolution. He recognized that humanity was indeed undergoing a psychic awakening that would fundamentally transform the species, but he also understood that this transformation carried enormous risks that required careful management to avoid catastrophic consequences. The challenge lay in developing policies that could harness the benefits of psychic development while minimizing the dangers associated with uncontrolled exposure to warp energies. The growing debate within the legions reflected broader tensions about the direction of imperial policy and the proper balance between innovation and caution in addressing new challenges. Some Primarchs argued for aggressive expansion of psychic training programs that could prepare larger numbers of Space Marines to develop and control psychic abilities safely. Others advocated for strict limitations on psychic practice that would minimize risks, even if they also limited potential benefits. The question of regulation became increasingly urgent as reports of psychic incidents continued to accumulate, and their severity appeared to be increasing over time. The most recent cases involved phenomena that exceeded anything previously documented, including instances where individual psychers had manifested abilities that affected entire battlefields or created lasting changes to local environmental conditions. These developments suggested that the current informal approach to managing psychic development within the legions was becoming inadequate for addressing the scale and complexity of the challenges involved. The Emperor's decision to convene a formal council to address these issues reflected his recognition that the question of psychic power within the legions required systematic consideration and official policy guidance that could be implemented consistently across all Imperial forces. The informal protocols that had developed during the early years of the Crusade were no longer sufficient for managing a phenomenon that was affecting increasing numbers of Space Marines and creating tactical situations that existing doctrine had not anticipated. The selection of Nicaea as the location for this council was influenced by the planet's history as a center of learning and philosophical discourse, qualities that would be essential for addressing the complex issues surrounding psychic development and regulation. The world's academic institutions and cultural traditions emphasized reasoned debate and systematic analysis of controversial topics, providing an appropriate setting for discussions that would determine imperial policy on one of the most contentious issues facing the growing empire. The Council of Nicaea's conclusion marked what many would later recognize as the beginning of the end for the Emperor's grand vision of human unity. The prohibition of psychic practices within the Space Marine legions, while intended to prevent the catastrophic corruption that had befallen other species, created resentments and divisions that would prove far more dangerous than the powers it sought to suppress. Magnus, the Red's bitter departure from Nicaea, his protests overruled and his life's work declared heretical, represented the first crack in the foundation of loyalty that had bound the Primarchs to their father's will. The Emperor's withdrawal from active command of the Great Crusade to pursue the Webway Project beneath Terra's surface created a vacuum of leadership that would have profound consequences for the unity of his sons. For decades, the Primarchs had grown accustomed to direct access to their father's guidance and approval, their sibling rivalries and philosophical disagreements mediated by his presence and authority. The appointment of Horus Lupercal as War Master was intended to provide the necessary leadership structure for the Crusade's continuation, but it fundamentally altered the dynamics between the Primarchs in ways that the Emperor either failed to anticipate or chose to ignore in his urgency to complete the Webway. Horus had earned his position through a combination of military brilliance, political acumen, and the genuine affection his brother Primarchs held for him. His campaigns with the Luna Wolves had established him as perhaps the most successful of all the Primarchs in terms of worlds brought into compliance and enemy forces defeated. More importantly, he possessed the diplomatic skills necessary to coordinate the efforts of his often fractious brothers, mediating their disputes and finding ways to channel their diverse approaches to warfare toward common objectives. The Emperor's confidence in Horus was well-founded based on past performance, but it failed to account for the psychological pressures that would accompany the transition from favored son to supreme military commander. The Great Crusade's momentum during the early years of Horus's leadership appeared to validate the Emperor's decision to delegate operational command while focusing on his secret project. Compliance rates actually increased as the War Master implemented more efficient coordination between different expedition fleets and established standardized protocols for managing newly conquered worlds. The Primarchs, despite their occasional disagreements, generally accepted Horus's authority and worked within the command structure he established. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet under Horus's direct command became a model for other Imperial forces, demonstrating how multiple legions could cooperate effectively when properly coordinated. However, the seeds of future catastrophe were already present in the growing distance between the Emperor and his sons. The Primarchs had been created not merely as military commanders, but as extensions of the Emperor's own will, designed to carry forward his vision for humanity's future. Their psychological makeup included deep-seated needs for paternal approval and guidance that could not be satisfied by delegation to even the most capable of their number. The Emperor's increasing absence from their lives, combined with his apparent lack of interest in their achievements and concerns, created emotional wounds that would prove vulnerable to exploitation by forces that understood the power of resentment and abandonment. The campaign against the Interrex demonstrated both the heights of achievement possible under Horus's leadership and the subtle ways in which chaos influence was beginning to affect Imperial decision-making. The Interrex represented a human civilization that had achieved remarkable technological sophistication while maintaining peaceful coexistence with several Xeno species. Their society had developed comprehensive understanding of chaos corruption and had implemented systematic measures to prevent its spread, including the quarantine of chaos artifacts and the education of their population about the dangers posed by warp entities. The initial negotiations between Imperial forces and the Interrex proceeded smoothly, with both sides recognizing the potential benefits of cooperation between human civilizations that had survived the age of strife through different approaches. The Interrex possessed technologies that could enhance Imperial military capabilities, while the Imperium offered protection and resources that could strengthen Interrex colonies against external threats. However, the theft of the Chaos Sword anatheme from an Interrex museum by Erebus of the Word Bearers created a crisis that transformed potential alliance into devastating warfare. The subsequent conflict destroyed the Interrex civilization and eliminated a potential source of knowledge about chaos resistance that might have proven invaluable for Imperial forces. More significantly, the incident demonstrated how easily Imperial forces could be manipulated into actions that served chaos interests while appearing to advance Imperial objectives. The theft of the anatheme was not merely an act of greed or curiosity, but a carefully planned operation designed to acquire a weapon that would later be used to corrupt Horus himself. Erebus's role in these events reflected the broader corruption that had taken root within the Word Bearers' Legion following their humiliation at Monarchia. Lorgar's public chastisement by the Emperor for his religious practices had created deep resentment within the 17th Legion, resentment that had been carefully cultivated and directed by chaos entities seeking to create instruments for their own purposes. The Word-Bearers' pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror, ostensibly undertaken to understand the Emperor's rejection of divinity, had instead exposed them to direct chaos influence that transformed their religious devotion from imperial worship to chaos veneration. The corruption of the Word-Bearers proceeded gradually and systematically, with chaos entities providing them with knowledge and power that appeared to validate their belief that the Emperor had been wrong to reject religious truth. Lorgar's discovery of the Chaos Gods and their role in galactic affairs convinced him that the imperial truth was not merely misguided, but actively harmful to humanity's spiritual development. His transformation from devoted son to bitter enemy was facilitated by chaos entities that understood exactly how to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities and ideological convictions. The establishment of chaos cults within the Word-Bearers created a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Legion itself. Word-Bearers, chaplains, and missionaries, who had been deployed throughout the Imperium to spread the imperial truth, instead began spreading chaos doctrine, carefully disguised as secular philosophy or practical advice. Their influence reached into other legions, imperial army units, and civilian populations across hundreds of worlds, creating the foundation for the widespread rebellion that would soon engulf the galaxy. The wounding of Horus on Davin represented the culmination of decades of careful planning by chaos forces seeking to corrupt the Emperor's most favored son. The anathema weapon stolen from the Interrex had been crafted specifically to inflict wounds that could not be healed through conventional means, its chaos-tainted blade carrying corruption that would spread through the victim's body and soul. The timing of the attack was carefully coordinated to occur when Horus was psychologically vulnerable, his confidence shaken by recent setbacks, and his relationship with the Emperor strained by their increasing separation. The decision to seek healing for Horus through the chaos-corrupted rituals of Davin's warrior lodges represented a fundamental breach of imperial doctrine that had been engineered through months of subtle manipulation. Erebus and other word-bearers had carefully prepared the Luna Wolves' leadership for this moment, introducing them to the warrior lodge traditions and gradually normalizing the idea that ancient wisdom might offer solutions that imperial science could not provide. The ritual that was supposed to heal Horus instead opened his mind to direct chaos influence, allowing entities of the warp to show him visions that would transform his understanding of the Emperor's true nature and intentions. The visions presented to Horus during his corruption combined truth with lies in ways designed to maximize their psychological impact. The chaos entities showed him accurate images of the Emperor's plans for the Webway Project and his intention to guide humanity's evolution into a psychic species, but they interpreted these plans as evidence of the Emperor's desire to abandon his sons once they had served their purpose. The future they revealed showed the Primarchs relegated to ceremonial roles, while the Emperor ruled through bureaucratic institutions and psychic manipulation, their military achievements forgotten and their contributions to human unity dismissed as no longer necessary. These revelations struck at Horus's deepest fears and insecurities, confirming suspicions that had been growing during the Emperor's absence from the Crusade. The War Master's position, which had initially seemed like recognition of his unique capabilities and importance, now appeared to be merely a temporary expedient that would be discarded once the Emperor's true plans came to fruition. The visions suggested that all the Primarchs were ultimately expendable tools, created to serve specific purposes, and then abandoned when those purposes had been fulfilled. The corruption of Horus proceeded rapidly once his mind had been opened to chaos influence, his natural charisma and leadership abilities now serving the Ruinous Powers rather than the imperial cause. His transformation was subtle enough to avoid immediate detection by his closest advisors, manifesting initially as increased cynicism about imperial policy and growing criticism of the Emperor's methods. However, the fundamental change in his loyalties soon began to affect his decision-making in ways that would have catastrophic consequences for the Imperium. The recruitment of other Primarchs to Horus's cause required different approaches tailored to each brother's specific vulnerabilities and grievances. Fulgrim's corruption was achieved through his exposure to the Chaos Sword Lair, an artifact that gradually influenced his perfectionist nature toward increasingly extreme expressions of sensation and experience. The process was so gradual that Fulgrim himself remained unaware of the changes occurring in his personality and values until the corruption had become irreversible. Angron's recruitment was facilitated by his existing resentment toward the Emperor for denying him the chance to die, alongside his gladiator brothers on New Syria. The War Master's arguments about the Emperor's callous treatment of his sons resonated with Angron's own experiences, while the promise of unlimited warfare and bloodshed appealed to the neurological damage inflicted by the Butcher's nails. The World Eater's transformation into Khorne's servants required minimal external influence, as their existing culture of violence and aggression already aligned closely with the Blood God's desires. Mortarian's corruption represented a more complex challenge, given his natural resistance to psychic influence and his deep suspicion of supernatural powers. However, his resentment toward the Emperor for intervening in his war against the Pale Kings created an emotional vulnerability that could be exploited. The promise that joining Horus would allow him to prove his worth through his own achievements rather than living in the Emperor's shadow appealed to his pride and desire for independence. The recruitment of Magnus the Red required a different approach entirely, as the Primarch remained loyal to the Emperor despite his anger over the Council of Nicaea's decisions. Horus's corruption of Magnus was achieved not through direct persuasion, but through manipulation of circumstances that would force the Thousand Sons Primarch to violate the Emperor's explicit commands. The warning that Magnus attempted to send to the Emperor about Horus's treachery was delivered through psychic means that breached the Webway's protective barriers, causing catastrophic damage to the project that the Emperor had sacrificed so much to complete. The destruction of the Webway's protective barriers represented the death of the Emperor's ultimate vision for humanity's future. The psychic breach created by Magnus's warning allowed chaos entities to pour into the tunnel network that the Emperor had spent decades constructing, forcing him to abandon his work and take direct action to prevent the complete collapse of the project. The irony that Magnus's attempt to warn his father about Horus's treachery had instead doomed the very project that was supposed to secure humanity's future was not lost on the chaos entities that had orchestrated these events. The Emperor's forced abandonment of the Webway Project to deal with the chaos incursion represented a strategic defeat of unprecedented magnitude. The tunnel network that was supposed to free humanity from dependence on warp travel was now compromised beyond repair, its corridors infested with demons that would require constant vigilance to contain. The psychic lighthouse that was supposed to guide humanity's evolution into a fully psychic species had become a beacon for chaos entities seeking entry into the material realm. The psychological impact of this disaster on the Emperor was profound, though he revealed little of his feelings to those around him. The project that had consumed decades of his attention and represented the culmination of millennia of planning had been destroyed not by external enemies, but by the actions of his own son attempting to serve his interests. The bitter irony of Magnus's loyalty causing more damage than Horus's treachery would have long-lasting effects on the Emperor's approach to managing the crisis that was about to engulf the Imperium. The revelation of Horus's treachery through Magnus's warning came too late to prevent the rebellion from spreading throughout the legions and Imperial army units that had been corrupted through years of careful preparation. The Istvan system became the focal point for Horus's initial military operations, providing a secure base from which to coordinate the rebellion while eliminating loyalist forces that might have opposed his plans. The systematic massacre of loyalist elements within the traitor legions demonstrated the thoroughness of the corruption that had taken root and the ruthless efficiency with which Horus was prepared to pursue his goals. The Istvan III atrocity revealed the true extent of Horus's transformation from beloved son to implacable enemy. The virus bombing of the planet's surface eliminated not only the loyalist space marines who had been deployed there, but also millions of Imperial Army personnel and civilian populations, whose only crime had been their continued loyalty to the Emperor. The scale of the massacre demonstrated that Horus was prepared to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve victory, his former concern for human life replaced by cold calculation about tactical advantages and strategic necessities. The drop site massacre at Istvan V represented the moment when the Horus heresy transformed from a rebellion into a full-scale civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. The carefully orchestrated ambush of loyalist forces demonstrated the extent of the conspiracy that Horus had created, with multiple legions coordinating their betrayal to achieve maximum psychological and military impact. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard who survived the massacre were so badly mauled that they would play minimal roles in the remainder of the conflict, their combat effectiveness eliminated through a single devastating action. The strategic implications of the drop site massacre extended far beyond the immediate military losses to encompass the complete breakdown of trust between different Imperial institutions. The revelation that entire Space Marine legions had turned traitor created paranoia and suspicion throughout Imperial forces, making coordination between different units extremely difficult. The loyalty of individual commanders became suspect, while communication networks that had previously facilitated cooperation now became potential sources of disinformation and sabotage. The division of the Space Marine legions into loyalist and traitor factions created a military balance that would prolong the conflict for years, while maximizing the destruction inflicted on both sides. Horus's forces possessed significant advantages in terms of preparation and coordination, having spent years positioning themselves for rebellion, while their opponents remained unaware of the threat. However, the Loyalist legions retained control of key strategic positions and manufacturing centers that would prove crucial for sustaining prolonged warfare. The Emperor's response to the revelation of Horus's treachery was shaped by his understanding that the rebellion represented not merely a military challenge, but an existential threat to humanity's future. The corruption of his most trusted son and the destruction of the Webway Project had eliminated the carefully planned path toward human transcendence, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire vision for the species might be doomed to failure. The war that was about to engulf the galaxy would determine not only the fate of the Imperium, but the ultimate destiny of humanity itself. The Horus Heresy's inexorable march toward Terra represented the culmination of humanity's greatest civil war, as the War Master's corrupted forces carved a bloody path through the galaxy toward the throne world of the Imperium. The years of conflict had transformed both sides beyond recognition, with loyalist and traitor forces alike bearing the scars of battles that had consumed entire star systems and reduced once prosperous worlds to radioactive wastelands. The Emperor's decision to recall his scattered loyal sons and consolidate Imperial defenses around Terra reflected his understanding that the coming battle would determine not merely the fate of his Imperium, but the survival of humanity as a unified species. The preparation of Terra's defenses under Rogel Dorn's meticulous supervision transformed the cradle of humanity into the most heavily fortified world in the galaxy. The Imperial Fists Primarch approached the task with characteristic methodical precision, analyzing every possible avenue of attack and constructing overlapping defensive systems that could channel enemy forces into predetermined kill zones. The palace walls were reinforced with adamantium plating and equipped with void shield generators powerful enough to deflect orbital bombardment. Weapon emplacements were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire that would prevent any assault force from finding safe approaches to the palace's outer perimeters. The construction of these fortifications required the mobilization of Terra's entire industrial capacity, with forge complexes working around the clock to produce the massive quantities of materials needed for Dorn's ambitious defensive schemes. Ancient archaeotech weapons were brought out of storage and integrated into the palace's defensive grid, their exotic energy signatures adding unpredictable elements that would complicate enemy tactical planning. The Mechanicum's most skilled tech, Adeptus, supervised the installation of these systems, ensuring that each component was properly calibrated and integrated with the overall defensive network. The civilian population of Terra faced evacuation to underground shelters that had been carved deep into the planet's bedrock during the early years of Imperial expansion. These vast subterranean complexes could house millions of people for extended periods, their life support systems drawing power from geothermal sources that would remain functional even if the planet's surface infrastructure was completely destroyed. The evacuation process itself became a massive logistical undertaking, requiring careful coordination to prevent panic while ensuring that essential personnel remained available to support the palace's defensive operations. The Loyalist Space Marine legions that remained available for Terra's defense had been severely depleted by years of brutal warfare across the galaxy. The Imperial Fists bore primary responsibility for the palace's defense, their expertise in siege warfare making them ideally suited for the static defensive operations that would characterize the coming battle. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius brought their unique combination of artistic sensibility and martial prowess to the defense, their Primarch's inspirational presence providing crucial morale support for the human defenders who would bear the brunt of the enemy assault. The White Scar's hit-and-run tactics proved invaluable for disrupting enemy supply lines and reconnaissance efforts during the approach to Terra. Jagatai Khan's warriors specialized in rapid strikes against isolated enemy formations, their speed and mobility allowing them to engage superior forces on favorable terms before withdrawing to safety. These operations prevented Horus from achieving complete intelligence dominance over Terra's defensive preparations, while inflicting steady casualties on traitor forces that could not be easily replaced. The Custodian Guard represented the Emperor's personal military force, their individual combat capabilities exceeding even those of Space Marines through genetic modifications and training regimens that had remained unchanged since the Unification Wars. These golden-armored warriors had spent centuries perfecting their skills in the defense of the Imperial Palace, their knowledge of every corridor and chamber making them devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat that would characterize much of the siege. Each custodian was equipped with master-crafted weapons and artificer armor that incorporated technologies dating back to the Dark Age, making them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The arrival of Horus's fleet in the Sol system marked the beginning of the final phase of the heresy, as massive battleships bearing the corrupted insignia of once loyal legions took up positions around Terra's orbital space. The traitor fleet's composition reflected the diverse forces that had rallied to the War Master's banner, including not only the corrupted Space Marine legions, but also Dark Mechanicum forged ships, Chaos corrupted Imperial Army regiments, and Xeno's auxiliaries that had allied with the rebellion in hopes of sharing in the Imperium's destruction. The initial orbital bombardment of Terra's surface demonstrated the scale of destruction that modern Imperial weapons could inflict when deployed without restraint. Macro-cannon batteries aboard traitor battleships poured fire into the planet's defensive installations, while lance arrays carved molten trenches across the landscape. The void shields protecting the Imperial Palace flickered under the sustained assault, their generators straining to dissipate energy levels that exceeded their design specifications. However, Dorne's defensive preparations had anticipated such attacks, with backup power systems and redundant shield generators ensuring that the palace's primary defenses remained operational despite the devastating bombardment. The deployment of traitor forces to Terra's surface required massive logistical coordination as hundreds of thousands of Chaos Space Marines, corrupted Imperial Army troops, and Demon engines were transported from orbit to staging areas around the Imperial Palace. The traitor legions had been transformed by their exposure to Chaos corruption, their power armor bearing blasphemous symbols and mutations that reflected their allegiance to the Ruinous Powers. The World Eaters had devolved into frenzied berserkers, whose only desire was close combat and bloodshed, while the Emperor's children pursued increasingly extreme forms of sensation and experience that had left many of them barely recognizable as human. The Iron Warriors under Perturabo brought their expertise in siege warfare to bear against Dorne's fortifications, their methodical approach to reducing defensive positions contrasting sharply with the more chaotic tactics employed by other traitor legions. Perturabo's forces constructed massive siege engines and artillery batteries that could breach even the palace's adamantium-reinforced walls, their systematic approach to the siege reflecting the Primarch's bitter determination to prove his superiority over his rival. The rivalry between Perturabo and Dorne added a personal dimension to the siege that intensified the brutality of the fighting around the palace's outer defenses. The Word-Bearer's role in the siege extended beyond conventional military operations to encompass the summoning and binding of demon entities that could assault the palace's defenders with supernatural abilities. Lorgar's Legion had become masters of chaos sorcery during their years of corruption, their chaplains and dark apostles conducting rituals that tore holes in reality and allowed warp entities to manifest in the material realm. These demonic forces proved particularly effective against defensive positions that had been designed to repel conventional attacks, their supernatural abilities allowing them to bypass physical barriers and strike directly at the palace's defenders. The siege's progression through Terra's outer defensive rings demonstrated both the effectiveness of Dorne's preparations and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Horus's forces. Each defensive line was designed to extract maximum casualties from attacking forces, while providing covered withdrawal routes for Imperial defenders when positions became untenable. The fighting was characterized by brutal close-quarters combat in bombed-out ruins and collapsed tunnels, with individual squads of Space Marines holding critical positions against overwhelming odds while their comrades fell back to prepared secondary positions. The breakthrough to the palace's outer walls marked a critical phase in the siege, as traitor forces finally reached the massive fortifications that represented the last barrier between them and the Emperor himself. The walls stretched for hundreds of kilometers around the palace complex, their height and thickness designed to withstand even direct hits from battleship-grade weapons. However, the sustained bombardment and the supernatural abilities of demonic forces had created breaches that allowed assault troops to establish footholds within the palace's outer perimeter. The fighting within the palace itself took on an increasingly desperate character as loyalist forces were compressed into an ever-shrinking defensive perimeter. The corridors and chambers that had once served as administrative centers and ceremonial spaces were transformed into killing grounds, where every room was contested with bolter fire and blade work. The custodian guards' intimate knowledge of the palace's layout allowed them to channel enemy forces into carefully prepared ambush sites, but their limited numbers meant that each casualty represented an irreplaceable loss of combat effectiveness. Sanguinius's defense of the Eternity Gate became one of the siege's most heroic episodes, as the Blood Angels Primarch single-handedly held the critical chokepoint against waves of traitor assault troops. The massive portal represented the final barrier protecting the Emperor's throne room. Its destruction would allow enemy forces direct access to the heart of Imperial power. Sanguinius fought with desperate fury against overwhelming odds, his angelic wings carrying him above the melee, while his blade carved through enemy ranks with supernatural precision. The sight of their Primarch's solitary stand inspired the remaining Blood Angels to feats of heroism that held the gate against impossible odds. The Emperor's decision to lower the void shields protecting the vengeful spirit represented a calculated gamble that reflected his understanding of the siege's ultimate dynamics. The prolonged fighting had demonstrated that conventional defensive operations, no matter how skillfully conducted, could not indefinitely hold back the massive forces that Horus had assembled. The Loyalist defenders were being slowly ground down by attrition, their casualties mounting faster than they could be replaced, while enemy reinforcements continued to arrive from orbit. Only direct action against Horus himself could break the siege and prevent Terra's complete destruction. The teleporter assault on the vengeful spirit brought together the Emperor's most trusted companions for what all understood would be the final confrontation of the heresy. The strike force included Rogel Dorn, whose defensive expertise had bought time for this desperate gambit, and Sanguinius, whose inspirational leadership had sustained loyalist morale throughout the siege's darkest moments. The selection of these particular warriors reflected both their tactical capabilities and the Emperor's assessment of their psychological resilience in facing the corrupted War Master who had once been his most beloved son. The interior of the vengeful spirit had been transformed by years of chaos corruption into a nightmare landscape that defied rational comprehension. The ship's corridors twisted through impossible geometries that violated the laws of physics, while the walls pulsed with organic growths that seemed to watch the intruders with malevolent intelligence. Demonic entities materialized from the shadows to attack the strike force, their supernatural abilities requiring constant vigilance and coordination to overcome. The very air was thick with psychic corruption that pressed against the minds of the loyalist warriors, seeking to exploit any moment of weakness or doubt. The separation of the strike force during their advance through the ship's corrupted passages was engineered by chaos entities seeking to isolate the Emperor from his companions before the final confrontation. Dorn and his Imperial fists found themselves trapped in a maze of shifting corridors that led them away from their intended destination, while Sanguinius was drawn into combat with multiple greater demons that prevented him from reaching the ship's bridge. These supernatural manipulations ensured that the Emperor would face Horus alone, without the support of his most capable warriors. The throne room of the vengeful spirit, where the final duel took place, had been transformed into a temple dedicated to chaos undivided, its architecture incorporating elements from all four ruinous powers in a blasphemous display of corruption. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, their twisted geometries designed to induce madness in any observer who studied them too closely. The air itself was thick with psychic energy that made breathing difficult and caused reality to flicker between different possible states. At the center of this nightmare sat Horus, his once noble features transformed by chaos corruption into something barely recognizable as having once been human. The War Master's physical transformation reflected the extent of his spiritual corruption. His power armor fused with his flesh in ways that created a hybrid of organic and mechanical components. His eyes burned with fires that seemed to come from the depths of the warp itself, while his voice carried harmonics that spoke directly to the listener's subconscious fears and desires. The Chaos Gods had invested so much of their power in their chosen champion that he had become something beyond a mere Primarch, a living avatar of their combined will to destroy the Emperor's vision for humanity. The battle between father and son encompassed both physical combat and a psychic struggle that took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Emperor's attacks combined his mastery of conventional weapons with psychic powers that could reshape reality at the molecular level, while Horus countered with abilities granted by his chaos patrons that allowed him to channel the raw power of the warp itself. Their weapons clashed with forces that created shockwaves throughout the ship's structure, the impact of their blows causing reality to fracture and reform around them. The psychological dimension of their conflict proved as important as the physical combat, as both combatants sought to undermine their opponent's will to continue fighting. Horus attempted to convince the Emperor that his vision for humanity was fundamentally flawed, that the species required the guidance of the Chaos Gods to achieve their true potential. The Emperor responded by showing Horus visions of what humanity could become if freed from chaos corruption, the peaceful and prosperous civilization that could emerge from the ashes of the current conflict. The intervention of Aulanius Pius, an ordinary Imperial army trooper who had somehow reached the throne room despite the supernatural barriers that protected it, represented a moment of pure human courage that would resonate throughout Imperial history. The guardsman's attempt to protect the Emperor from Horus's final assault demonstrated the loyalty and sacrifice that ordinary humans could achieve when inspired by the Imperial ideal. His death at Horus's hands served as a catalyst that finally allowed the Emperor to overcome his paternal feelings and take the decisive action necessary to end the threat his son represented. The Emperor's psychic assault that destroyed Horus required him to channel power levels that exceeded even his normally superhuman capabilities. The attack targeted not merely Horus's physical form, but his very soul, burning away the chaos corruption that had transformed him, while simultaneously erasing the essence that had made him the Emperor's son. The psychic energies involved in this assault were so intense that they created permanent damage to the Emperor's own physical form, injuries that would prove impossible to heal through any conventional means. The mortal wounding of the Emperor during this final confrontation resulted from the feedback effects of destroying a being who had been so heavily invested with chaos power. The psychic backlash from Horus's destruction tore through the Emperor's body like molten metal, causing injuries that penetrated to the cellular level and beyond. His nervous system was so severely damaged that he could no longer maintain conscious control over his physical form, while his psychic abilities became increasingly difficult to focus and direct with precision. The Emperor's installation upon the Golden Throne represented a desperate attempt to preserve his life and maintain the psychic functions that were essential for the Imperium's survival. The ancient device had originally been designed as a control mechanism for the Webway Project, its psychic amplification capabilities intended to allow the Emperor to maintain the protective barriers that kept chaos entities from entering the tunnel network. However, the destruction of those barriers during Magnus's warning had transformed the throne from a tool of creation into a life support system that could sustain the Emperor's failing body, while channeling his remaining psychic power toward essential functions. The Golden Throne's operation required constant maintenance by the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose tech priests worked tirelessly to keep the ancient mechanisms functioning despite their incomplete understanding of the device's fundamental principles. The throne's power requirements were enormous, demanding the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily to provide the psychic energy necessary to sustain both the Emperor's life and the astronomican beacon that guided Imperial ships through the warp. These sacrifices represented a grim irony, as the Emperor who had once sought to eliminate humanity's dependence on psychic power now required their constant consumption to maintain his existence. The transformation of the Emperor from active ruler to passive beacon fundamentally altered the nature of imperial governance and the relationship between the throne and its subjects. The vibrant, charismatic leader who had personally guided the Great Crusade and shaped imperial policy through direct intervention was replaced by a silent figure whose will could only be interpreted through the pronouncements of the Adeptus Terra and other imperial institutions. This change created opportunities for corruption and misinterpretation that would plague the Imperium for millennia to come. The astronomican's maintenance became the Emperor's primary function during his entombment upon the Golden Throne, as the psychic lighthouse that guided imperial navigation required constant attention to maintain its signal strength and directional accuracy. Without this beacon, imperial fleets would be unable to navigate the warp safely, effectively cutting off communication and trade between different sectors of the Imperium. The Emperor's psychic presence within the beacon also provided some measure of protection against chaos entities seeking to corrupt imperial ships during warp transit, though this protection was far less comprehensive than what the completed Webway would have provided. The prevention of catastrophic warp breach through Terra's damaged Webway portal required a significant portion of the Emperor's remaining psychic power, as chaos entities continued to press against the barriers that prevented their entry into the material realm. The constant struggle to maintain these defenses left the Emperor with limited capacity for other activities, effectively ending his ability to provide active guidance for imperial policy or military operations. The silent vigil he maintained against the forces of chaos became a form of sacrifice that would continue for 10,000 years, his consciousness focused entirely on preventing the destruction that his original vision had sought to avoid. The Emperor's binding to the Golden Throne represented the death of his grand design for humanity's future and the beginning of a new phase of human history characterized by stagnation, superstition, and gradual decline. The Webway Project lay in ruins, its tunnels infested with demons that would require constant vigilance to contain. The rational enlightenment of the imperial truth was already giving way to the religious devotion that would transform the Emperor from a man into a god in the minds of his subjects. The unified human species that he had sought to create was fragmenting into the rigid hierarchies and competing institutions that would define the Imperium for millennia to come. The 10 millennia that followed the Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne witnessed a gradual but inexorable transformation of his original vision into something he would barely recognize. The rational, secular empire he had sought to create through the imperial truth became the most theocratic civilization in human history, with the Emperor himself elevated to the status of the God Emperor, despite his explicit rejection of divinity during his active reign. This transformation began almost immediately after the Siege of Terra, as traumatized survivors struggled to comprehend how their immortal leader could have been brought so low by his own son. The first signs of the Emperor's deification emerged within the ecclesiarchy's predecessor organizations during the early 31st millennium, as imperial administrators and military commanders sought to maintain morale among populations devastated by the heresy's aftermath. The official imperial position maintained that the Emperor remained a man, albeit one possessed of abilities far beyond normal human comprehension. However, the practical requirements of governing a traumatized empire led to increasingly religious interpretations of his nature and his continuing presence upon the Golden Throne. The development of imperial cult doctrine proceeded through a complex process of theological evolution that incorporated elements from pre-imperial religions, cultural traditions from compliant worlds, and entirely new mythological frameworks created to explain the Emperor's apparent immortality and ongoing psychic presence. The Lectitio Divinitatis, originally written by Lorger before his corruption, provided much of the theological foundation for these developments despite its author's subsequent fall to chaos. The irony that the Emperor's deification was based partly on the writings of one of his greatest enemies was lost on most imperial citizens, who viewed the text as divinely inspired scripture. The transformation of the imperial truth into the imperial creed required systematic reinterpretation of the Emperor's original teachings to accommodate religious worship, while maintaining some connection to his secular philosophy. Imperial theologians developed sophisticated arguments that the Emperor's rejection of divinity had been a necessary deception to prevent humanity from becoming dependent on religious thinking before they were ready to understand his true nature. They argued that his apparent mortality and his emphasis on reason had been pedagogical tools designed to strengthen human self-reliance until the species could safely embrace the spiritual truths that religious devotion revealed. This theological framework allowed imperial doctrine to maintain that the Emperor had always been divine, while explaining why he had concealed this truth during his active reign. The imperial cult taught that the Emperor's sacrifice upon the Golden Throne had been a voluntary act of divine love, undertaken to protect humanity from the forces of chaos through his eternal vigilance. His continuing presence within the Astronomicon became evidence of his ongoing care for his people, while the psychic phenomena associated with imperial saints and miracles were interpreted as manifestations of his divine while operating through faithful servants. The rise of the Adeptus Ministorum as the Imperium's official religious organization formalized the transformation of imperial society from secular to theocratic governance. The ecclesiarchy's influence extended far beyond spiritual matters to encompass education, social welfare, and even military operations through the Adeptus Sororitas and other militant orders. The organization's vast bureaucracy developed its own interpretations of imperial doctrine that often diverged significantly from the Emperor's original teachings, creating a religious orthodoxy that prioritized faith over reason and obedience over innovation. The ecclesiarchy's control over imperial education systems ensured that subsequent generations of imperial citizens would be raised with religious rather than secular worldviews. The scientific rationalism that the Emperor had promoted was gradually replaced by faith-based explanations for natural phenomena, with imperial doctrine teaching that the Emperor's divine will govern everything from weather patterns to technological function. This transformation had profound implications for imperial technological development, as the pursuit of knowledge became subordinated to religious orthodoxy and the preservation of existing doctrine. The corruption of the Emperor's vision extended beyond religious transformation to encompass the very structure of imperial society and governance. The unified human species he had sought to create fragmented into rigid hierarchical castes that prevented social mobility and innovation. The Adeptus Terra developed into a vast bureaucratic machine that prioritized administrative procedure over effective governance, while the various Adepta became competing power centers that pursued their own institutional interests rather than serving the broader imperial mission. The Space Marine chapters that emerged from the Second Founding represented a fundamental departure from the Emperor's original conception of the legions as instruments of unification and exploration. The smaller chapter structure was designed to prevent the kind of large-scale rebellion that had characterized the Horus Heresy, but it also eliminated the legion's capacity for major strategic operations and reduced their effectiveness as tools of imperial expansion. Many chapters developed their own cultural traditions and interpretations of imperial doctrine that diverged significantly from the Emperor's original vision, creating warrior monks whose primary loyalty was to their chapter rather than to humanity as a whole. The Codex Astartes, while successful in preventing another heresy-scale rebellion, also institutionalized the fragmentation of imperial military power and reduced the Space Marine's strategic flexibility. The rigid adherence to prescribed tactical doctrines and organizational structures prevented adaptation to new threats and circumstances, creating military forces that were often less effective than the original legions had been. The reverence accorded to the Codex as holy scripture rather than practical guidance further reduced its effectiveness by discouraging innovation and tactical experimentation. The development of the Imperial Guard as the Imperium's primary military force reflected the transformation of imperial society from a dynamic, expansionist civilization into a defensive, conservative empire focused primarily on maintaining existing territories rather than expanding human dominion. The Guard's organizational structure emphasized quantity over quality, producing vast numbers of moderately trained soldiers rather than the elite forces that had characterized the Great Crusade. This approach was necessitated by the Imperium's vast territorial extent and the constant threats it faced, but it also represented a significant reduction in military effectiveness compared to the combined Space Marine legions and Imperial army of the Crusade era. The Adeptus Mechanicus evolved from the Emperor's allies into an increasingly independent organization whose interpretation of imperial doctrine differed markedly from mainstream imperial theology. The tech priests' worship of the Omnissiah became increasingly focused on the preservation of existing knowledge rather than the development of new technologies, creating a technological stagnation that would have horrified the Emperor. Their ritual-based approach to technology maintenance and their suspicion of innovation represented a complete reversal of the scientific rationalism that had characterized imperial policy during the Great Crusade. The relationship between the Mechanicus and the broader Imperium became increasingly strained as both organizations developed their own interpretations of the Emperor's legacy and his continuing will. The tech priests maintained that their worship of the Omnissiah represented the true understanding of the Emperor's divine nature, while the ecclesiarchy insisted that their theological framework provided the only legitimate interpretation of imperial doctrine. These competing claims to religious authority created ongoing tensions that weakened imperial unity and effectiveness. The Inquisition's development as an organization dedicated to identifying and eliminating threats to imperial orthodoxy represented both a necessary response to the ongoing chaos threat and a significant departure from the Emperor's original vision of human society. The Inquisitor's broad authority to investigate and judge imperial citizens created a climate of fear and suspicion that stifled innovation and independent thinking. Their role in enforcing religious orthodoxy made them instruments of the very superstition and dogmatism that the Emperor had sought to eliminate through the imperial truth. The various inquisitorial factions that emerged over the millennia developed their own interpretations of imperial doctrine and their proper role in defending humanity from its enemies. The Puritans' rigid adherence to established orthodoxy often conflicted with the radicals' willingness to use any means necessary to combat chaos corruption, creating internal conflicts that weakened the organization's effectiveness. These disputes reflected broader tensions within imperial society between conservative and progressive approaches to governance and defense. The Navigator House's evolution from essential servants of imperial expansion into hereditary aristocrats who controlled interstellar commerce represented another departure from the Emperor's egalitarian vision. The Navigators' monopoly on warp travel gave them enormous political and economic power that they used to advance their own interests rather than serving the broader imperial mission. Their genetic mutations, originally viewed as necessary adaptations for warp navigation, became marks of aristocratic status that separated them from ordinary humanity. The development of the rogue trader dynasties as quasi-independent imperial agents reflected the Imperium's inability to maintain direct control over its vast territories, while also representing a continuation of the expansionist spirit that had characterized the Great Crusade. These merchant explorers combined commercial interests with military capability, extending imperial influence into regions beyond the reach of regular imperial forces. However, their primary loyalty was often to their own dynasties rather than to the Imperium as a whole, creating potential conflicts between personal and imperial interests. The ongoing debate within imperial institutions about the emperor's true intentions and the proper interpretation of his legacy reflects the fundamental uncertainty that has characterized imperial governance since his entombment. Different factions within the Adeptus Terra, the Space Marine chapters, and other imperial organizations maintain competing theories about what the emperor would have wanted and how his vision should be implemented in the current era. These debates are complicated by the fact that the emperor's own writings and recorded statements from the Great Crusade era are often incomplete or contradictory, having been filtered through millennia of transcription and interpretation. Some imperial scholars argue that the emperor's transformation into a divine figure represents the natural evolution of his original plan, suggesting that his rejection of divinity during the Great Crusade was a temporary measure designed to prevent premature religious development. They point to his psychic powers and apparent immortality as evidence that he was always more than human, and they interpret his current state as a voluntary sacrifice that demonstrates his divine love for humanity. This interpretation supports the current theocratic structure of imperial society and the ecclesiarchy's dominant role in governance. Other imperial thinkers maintain that the current imperium represents a complete betrayal of the emperor's original vision, arguing that his secular, rationalist philosophy has been corrupted beyond recognition by the very religious thinking he sought to eliminate. They contend that the emperor's deification and the development of the imperial cult represent humanity's regression to the superstitious thinking that made them vulnerable to chaos corruption in the first place. This perspective suggests that true loyalty to the emperor would require dismantling the current religious orthodoxy and returning to the scientific rationalism of the imperial truth. The practical impossibility of determining the emperor's current will or obtaining his guidance on contemporary issues has created a situation where different imperial factions can claim his authority for contradictory policies and actions. The High Lords of Terra invoke his name to justify administrative decisions, while Space Marine chapter masters claim to follow his tactical doctrines in their military operations. The Inquisition cites his authority for their investigations and purges, while the ecclesiarchy uses his supposed divine nature to support their theological pronouncements. The question of whether the emperor's original vision can be reclaimed or fulfilled has become increasingly academic as the Imperium faces existential threats that require immediate responses rather than philosophical contemplation. The opening of the Great Rift has divided the galaxy and created new challenges that the current imperial structure is barely capable of addressing. The return of Robute Guilliman as Lord Commander has introduced new perspectives on imperial governance, but even his authority as a Primarch cannot definitively resolve questions about the Emperor's true intentions. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium stands as both a testament to the Emperor's achievements and a monument to the failure of his ultimate vision. Humanity has survived for 10,000 years in a hostile galaxy, maintaining a degree of unity and purpose that has allowed them to resist threats that have destroyed other species. The Astronomicon continues to guide Imperial ships through the warp, while the Emperor's psychic presence provides some protection against chaos corruption. The Space Marine chapters, despite their limitations, remain humanity's most effective warriors, while the Imperial Guard's vast armies defend countless worlds from Xenos invasion and heretical rebellion. Yet this survival has come at enormous cost in terms of human potential and achievement. The dynamic, expansionist civilization that conquered the galaxy during the Great Crusade has been replaced by a stagnant, defensive empire that struggles to maintain its existing territories. Technological innovation has largely ceased, replaced by ritual maintenance of existing systems whose principles are no longer understood. Scientific inquiry has been subordinated to religious orthodoxy, while independent thinking is discouraged or actively suppressed as potentially heretical. The transformation of the emperor from a man who rejected divinity into the god emperor of a theocratic empire represents perhaps the greatest irony in human history. His vision of a rational, secular civilization has been replaced by the very religious thinking he sought to eliminate, while his desire for human unity has been compromised by the rigid hierarchies and competing institutions that characterize contemporary imperial society. The Webway Project that was meant to free humanity from dependence on the warp has been replaced by continued reliance on dangerous warp travel, while the psychic evolution he sought to guide has proceeded without proper oversight or control. Whether this transformation represents a necessary adaptation to the realities of governing a galaxy-spanning empire or a fundamental betrayal of the Emperor's vision remains a subject of ongoing debate within imperial institutions. The practical requirements of maintaining order among trillions of human beings across hundreds of thousands of worlds may have made some form of religious unity inevitable, while the constant threat of chaos corruption might have necessitated the kind of rigid orthodoxy that characterizes the imperial cult. Alternatively, the current state of the Imperium might represent a series of historical accidents and poor decisions that could theoretically be reversed through proper leadership and institutional reform. The Emperor's continuing presence upon the Golden Throne ensures that these questions will remain relevant for as long as humanity survives in its current form. His silent vigil against the forces of chaos maintains the conditions that make imperial civilization possible, while his psychic influence continues to shape human development in ways that are not fully understood. The possibility that he might someday communicate his will directly to his subjects, or even return to active leadership, provides hope for those who believe that his original vision might yet be fulfilled. Until that time, the Imperium will continue to exist as both the greatest achievement of human civilization and the most profound disappointment of the master of mankind's grand design for his species' future.